It was sleek, it was fast, and it carried with it the hopes of an air war that had dragged on too long. The North American P-51 Mustang was more than just a fighter. It was the machine that turned the tide of the skies over Europe, born out of desperation, refined with ingenuity, and perfected with the raw lessons of combat. The Mustang would become the scourge of the Luftwaffe, escorting Allied bombers deep into German territory, and ensuring that those bombers came back home. In the struggle for air superiority, the P-51 was not just another aircraft. It was the difference between daylight bombing being a deadly gamble and daylight bombing becoming a relentless hammer that broke the Reich's industrial backbone. But the Mustang's story is not only about engineering brilliance. It is about daring pilots who strap themselves into its cockpit, knowing that each mission could be their last. It is about bitter duels with Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs high above Europe, where victory meant survival and defeat meant falling in flames. It is about innovation, the merging of an American airframe with a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that gave the Allies a plane with speed, range, and lethality unmatched by anything the Axis could field. The Mustang roared into history not just because of what it was, but because of what it made possible. Without it, the skies over Germany might have remained contested, the strategic bombing campaign might have faltered, and the Allied invasion of Europe could have faced an enemy far stronger in the air. With it, however, the balance shifted. Suddenly, bomber crews had guardians watching over them. Suddenly, the Luftwaffe's dominance crumbled. Suddenly, the Allies had a weapon that embodied precision, reach, and devastating effectiveness. Tonight, you will journey through the full history of the P-51 Mustang, from its rushed beginnings, to its engineering breakthroughs, to the stories of the men who flew it into legend. You will hear of desperate dogfights, of bombers saved by last-second Mustang interventions, and of how this single aircraft earned a place as one of the most iconic fighters in aviation history. So adjust your headphones, dim the lights, and let yourself be carried into the roar of Merlin engines and the crack of gunfire at 25,000 feet. This is not just the story of a plane. It is the story of the fighter that crushed the Luftwaffe and helped win the skies of World War II. And before we begin, tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from tonight, and what time is it for you? World War II was not only fought on land and sea, it was decided in the skies. From the very first months of the conflict, the dominance of air power shaped the fate of nations, dictating how battles were fought and how entire strategies were designed. The Luftwaffe's blitzkrieg in Poland, France, and the Low Countries had shown the terrifying power of coordinated air and ground operations. In Britain, the Royal Air Force fought for survival in the summer of 1940, proving that control of the skies was essential to the survival of a nation. Across the Atlantic, the United States watched with growing urgency, realizing that any future war would require vast fleets of fighters and bombers. Air power was not an accessory, it was the deciding factor in modern war. Into this world of desperate need and rapid innovation, a new fighter would emerge, one that would change the balance of the air war forever. It would not come from a carefully planned government project, nor from years of refinement, but from an urgent request and a bold gamble. Its name was the P-51 Mustang, and it would become a legend. The story of the Mustang began not as an American demand, but as a British request. In 1940, as Britain stood alone against Hitler's empire, the Royal Air Force desperately needed more fighters. Their own factories could not produce Spitfires and Hurricanes quickly enough to meet the threat of the Luftwaffe. They turned to the United States, placing orders with companies like Curtiss and North American Aviation. North American's president, James H. Dutch Kindelberger, saw an opportunity not just to sell planes, but to create something entirely new. When offered the chance to build Curtiss P-40 cells under license, he countered boldly his company could design a completely new fighter from scratch in record time. The RAF agreed, and the challenge was set: deliver a prototype in just 120 days. Out of that urgency, a sleek, low-wing fighter began to take shape on drawing boards in California. Few could have predicted that this machine, designed for Britain, would become the most iconic American fighter of the war. The legend of the Mustang was born from desperation and daring. As the war spread across continents, the role of air power became ever more critical. Bombers struck cities, factories, and armies deep behind the front lines, aiming to cripple the enemy's capacity to fight. Yet bombers without escorts were vulnerable prey, easily slaughtered by swarms of enemy fighters. The Luftwaffe had already proven this during raids over Britain and the early stages of the war against the Soviet Union. The Allies understood that winning the war would require not only strategic bombing campaigns, but also the ability to protect those bombers over long distances. Existing fighters, Spitfires, Hurricanes, P-47 and P-47Cs, could not escort bombers deep into enemy territory. The gap between range and mission needs threatened to make Allied air strategy collapse. Into this problem, the Mustang would rise like a savior. With its unmatched range, speed, and adaptability, it would become the fighter that changed the very definition of air warfare. The legend was not only about design, but about fulfilling the most urgent need of the war. When the Mustang finally entered combat, its reputation spread rapidly across the Allied air forces. Pilots who first flew it marveled at its speed, agility, and stability at high altitudes. Ground crews appreciated its ruggedness and ease of maintenance, while strategists recognized its unmatched range as the solution to escorting bombers deep into the Reich. More than just a machine, it became a morale weapon, inspiring confidence in those who flew it and those who relied on it. By 1944, the Mustang had become synonymous with control of the skies, the escort that finally allowed American bombers to reach Berlin in daylight and return home. Luftwaffe pilots, once masters of the European skies, now found themselves hunted by squadrons of sleek, silver Mustangs. The shift was more than tactical, it was psychological, a reversal of dominance that signaled the beginning of the end for the German Air Force. The Mustang became not just a fighter, but a symbol of Allied ascendancy. Its roar above the clouds was the sound of history turning. Yet the legend of the Mustang was not inevitable. It was forged in trial and error, in adaptation and reinvention. The first versions, powered by Allison engines, struggled at high altitude and seemed destined for a limited role. But the marriage of the Mustang airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine transformed it from a promising aircraft into a world-beating one. This transformation revealed the genius of innovation under pressure, a lesson that technology and necessity together create revolutions. What began as an aircraft for low-level reconnaissance and attack became the ultimate escort fighter of the war. Its evolution mirrored the war itself, starting with uncertainty, improving through hard lessons, and reaching maturity just as the balance of power shifted. By the time of D-Day, the Mustang was not only essential but indispensable. Every phase of its history added to its legend, until the P-51 became the very definition of what a fighter aircraft could achieve. The story of the Mustang was one of rebirth as much as birth, and in that story, it earned immortality. The Mustang's reputation extended far beyond the battlefield. It was hailed in newspapers, celebrated in propaganda films, and revered by the men who flew it. Photographs of Mustangs with distinctive nose art and gleaming canopies became symbols of freedom and air superiority. To bomber crews, seeing Mustangs form up alongside their formations meant survival, hope, and a chance to return home alive. To infantry on the ground, the roar of its Merlin engine was the promise of air cover against enemy armor and artillery. For civilians, especially those under occupation, the sight of Allied fighters soaring overhead was a glimpse of liberation to come. The Mustang was more than metal, rivets, and fuel. It was emotion, hope, and destiny carried on wings. Even German civilians, looking skyward as swarms of Allied planes filled the skies, understood what the Mustang represented: the inevitability of defeat. In this way, the Mustang's legend transcended its specifications. It became a symbol of the war's turning tide, a harbinger of freedom in flight. Historians would later debate whether the Mustang was truly the best fighter of the war. Some pointed to the Spitfire's grace, the Bf-109's longevity, or the FW-190's firepower. Others compared it to the Soviet Yak-3, La-7, or the Japanese Zero. Yet when measured not just by performance but by impact, the Mustang stood above them all. It was the aircraft that allowed daylight bombing to succeed, crippling Germany's industry and fuel supplies. It was the aircraft that brought the Luftwaffe to its knees, depriving Germany of the air superiority it had once wielded so effectively. It was the aircraft that escorted B-17S and B-24S to Berlin and back, breaking the back of German resistance in the skies. Its victories were not counted only in dogfights won, but in factories destroyed, supply chains broken, and armies left vulnerable to Allied ground advances. The Mustang's legacy is not in statistics alone, it is in the war it helped to win. That is why, decades later, it is still called the fighter that crushed the Luftwaffe. As we begin this story of the P-51 Mustang, we enter not just the history of an aircraft, but the saga of an icon. It is the tale of engineers who dared to create under impossible deadlines, of pilots who fought with courage at the edge of survival, and of nations that depended on wings to carry their hopes. The Mustang's journey spans continents, from design tables in California to skies over Britain, from escort missions over Berlin to long-range strikes in the Pacific. It is a story of transformation, from an aircraft built in desperation to one that defined air power for a generation. It is also a story of symbolism, the machine that embodied freedom, resilience, and victory. The roar of its engine, the gleam of its wings, the sight of it streaking through the clouds became images that outlasted the war itself. The Mustang did not just fight, it endured, living on in memory, museums, and airshows decades after the guns fell silent. Its steel and fire became legend, and in this documentary, we will tell the full story of that legend, chapter by chapter, in all its depth and detail. The year was 1940, and the world seemed to be collapsing under the weight of German aggression. France had fallen, the Low Countries had been overrun, and the Luftwaffe stood supreme across Europe. Britain, isolated and under siege, fought for survival in the skies over its homeland during the desperate days of the Battle of Britain. The Royal Air Force clung to victory with Spitfires and Hurricanes, but production could barely keep pace with losses. British officials turned to the United States, not yet in the war, but already the arsenal of democracy, for urgent aid. They sought fighters to bolster their exhausted squadrons, and initially turned to Curtiss and its P-40 Warhawk. Yet the British Purchasing Commission, surveying America's aircraft industry, made a bold approach to a relatively young company, North American Aviation. What happened next would shape the course of aerial warfare. Instead of simply building the outdated P-40 under license, North American offered a daring alternative. They would design and produce an entirely new fighter from scratch. The British agreed, and the countdown began for one of the most astonishing engineering feats of the Second World War. At the center of this gamble was James H. Dutch Kindelberger, the dynamic president of North American aviation. Ambitious, pragmatic, and driven, Kindelberger was determined to prove that his company could compete with the giants of American aviation. The British order presented both risk and opportunity. Success would mean prestige, contracts, and a place at the forefront of wartime production. Failure would mean ruin, both financially and reputationally. With his chief engineer Edgar Schmude, a German-born designer with a flair for innovation, Kindelberger assembled a team to meet the challenge. The task was daunting. Produce a prototype fighter in just 120 days. In an industry where development often stretched into years, this seemed almost impossible. But North American thrived on the urgency of war. Engineers worked around the clock, sketching designs, testing ideas, and shaping what would become the NA-73X prototype. Every decision carried weight. Every detail mattered. This was not just another airplane. It was a gamble that could define history. The design that Schmude and his team conceived was unlike anything the United States had produced before. It featured a sleek, laminar flow wing, carefully shaped to reduce drag and improve performance at higher speeds. The fuselage was streamlined for efficiency, with smooth lines that gave the aircraft both elegance and purpose. A belly-mounted radiator scoop, controversial at first, was positioned to take advantage of the Meredith effect, which could actually provide a small thrust bonus rather than drag. The cockpit offered excellent visibility, and the sturdy landing gear was designed to handle rough airfields in Britain's countryside. The Mustang was not simply a refinement of existing fighters. It was a bold leap into modern aerodynamics. Where the P-40 Warhawk was rugged but limited, the Mustang promised speed, agility, and endurance. The design was advanced for its time, reflecting both Schmude's European influences and American innovation. In the crucible of war, it was exactly the kind of bold step required. The NA-73X was beginning to take shape, not just on paper but in steel, rivets, and vision. The speed of development remains one of the most remarkable feats in aviation history. From the first sketches to the completed prototype, North American produced the NA-73X in an astonishing 117 days, just under the 120-day deadline. Engineers worked in shifts around the clock, the factory floor alive with the noise of drills, riveters, and assembly crews. Blueprints were drawn one day, and metal was cut the next, a seamless blend of design and production. Suppliers were pushed to deliver parts at unprecedented speed, while workers labored with a sense of urgency driven by news from Europe. Each day brought reports of German victories, reminding everyone that failure was not an option. On September 9, 1940, the NA-73X rolled out of the factory at Inglewood, California. Sleek, modern, and purposeful, it represented more than just an aircraft. It was proof of what American industry could accomplish under pressure. Observers marveled at the clean lines, the polished surfaces, the sense of speed even when standing still. In less than 4 months, a new fighter had been born. The gamble had paid off. The first flight of the NA-73X took place on October 26, 1940, with test pilot Vance Breeze at the controls. From the moment the Mustang left the runway, it was clear this was no ordinary fighter. The aircraft handled smoothly, responded crisply, and showed immediate promise in speed and maneuverability. Breeze reported that the Mustang climbed well, rolled quickly, and gave the pilot a sense of confidence rarely felt in such an early test. Engineers gathered every scrap of data, fine-tuning the aircraft after each flight. While there were issues, most notably with the Allison V1710 engine's poor high-altitude performance, the overall verdict was resoundingly positive. The Mustang was fast, agile, and efficient, with greater range than expected. Word of the successful flights reached both Washington and London, sparking interest far beyond the original British order. Here was a fighter that, with refinement, could rival or surpass anything flying over Europe. The Mustang's story was only beginning. Its potential was clear, even if its future path was not yet defined. The British, who had taken a gamble of their own in ordering the aircraft, were impressed. They ordered the Mustang Mimic I, equipping it with reconnaissance cameras and machine guns for low-level missions. At this stage, the aircraft was not yet the high-altitude champion it would become, but it filled an important niche. Its range allowed it to scout deep into enemy territory, photographing targets and mapping defenses. At low altitudes, it proved devastating as a ground attack aircraft, strafing convoys, rail lines, and troop concentrations. Pilots praised its handling and speed at these altitudes, calling it a joy to fly and a deadly weapon when used correctly. The Mustang entered combat in British hands in 1942, striking targets in occupied Europe. It was a strong beginning, but the true potential of the aircraft was still hidden, waiting for a breakthrough. That breakthrough would come with a new heart, the Merlin engine, but already the Mustang had proven itself. North American's gamble had produced results beyond expectation. For North American aviation, the success of the Mustang was more than just a contract fulfilled. It transformed the company from a rising manufacturer into one of the giants of the wartime aviation industry. The Inglewood plant expanded rapidly, with thousands of workers pouring in to meet production demands. The story of the Mustang became part of the American wartime narrative: ingenuity, speed, and industry overcoming impossible odds. Newspapers carried stories of the miracle fighter designed in just months. Workers took pride in the aircraft rolling off the lines, knowing each one carried with it the hopes of victory overseas. For the engineers, the project demonstrated the power of collaboration, vision, and daring. For Kindleberger and Schmude, it cemented their legacies as the men who brought the Mustang to life. The gamble had paid off not only in technical success, but in historical significance. The Mustang was no longer just a response to a request. It was a symbol of what America could achieve when pressed to act. The birth of the Mustang remains one of the most remarkable stories in aviation history, a tale of urgency, daring, and triumph. In less than 4 months, a company with no frontline fighter experience had designed a plane that would become legendary. It began with a British request, an American gamble, and the genius of engineers who believed they could do better than what existed. The INA 73X was more than an aircraft. It was a statement that innovation under pressure could change the course of war. Though its early versions had limitations, the foundation was solid, waiting for refinement that would elevate it to greatness. The Mustang's birth story set the stage for its transformation into the war's most decisive fighter. Every rivet, every wing contour, every design choice carried the weight of history. The Mustang had entered the skies. Its legend was beginning to take shape. And as we will see, this was only the first chapter in a saga that would stretch across continents, battles, and generations. The prototype NA-73X, born in record time at North American's Inglewood plant, was ready for its proving moment in late October 1940. On October 26th, under the watchful eyes of engineers, mechanics and executives, the sleek silver aircraft sat poised on the runway at Mines Field, Los Angeles. Test pilot Vance Breese, calm and methodical, climbed into the cockpit, adjusted his harness, and ran through the checklist with steady hands. The Allison V1710 engine rumbled to life, a sound both familiar and new, filling the morning air with promise and anticipation. As the aircraft accelerated down the strip, its wide-track landing gear gave stability, and within seconds the Mustang lifted smoothly into the air. Observers below held their breath as it climbed, banking gracefully against the California sky. Reports from Breese after that first flight confirmed what many hoped: the aircraft handled superbly, responsive to every movement, and stable in turns and climbs. The laminar flow wing performed as predicted, reducing drag and offering exceptional efficiency. There were no catastrophic flaws, no disastrous failures, only refinement needed. For North American, relief and pride swept across the team. The gamble had taken wing, and it soared with confidence. The early flight tests revealed an aircraft with excellent low and medium altitude performance. Engineers noted that the Mustang's speed exceeded expectations, making it faster than most existing US fighters of the time. It was also highly maneuverable, with crisp handling that test pilots praised as intuitive and reliable. Breese and later pilots reported that the Mustang's controls felt balanced, with no serious tendency toward stall or spin. Its wide landing gear, in contrast to the notoriously narrow gear of the Spitfire, made takeoffs and landings far safer and easier for average pilots. The belly radiator, once doubted, proved effective at cooling, and the Meredith effect offered a surprising boost of thrust that enhanced efficiency. In long-duration tests, the Mustang demonstrated impressive range thanks to its clean aerodynamic design and efficient fuel usage. These characteristics made it an excellent candidate for reconnaissance and ground attack, especially for the RAF's needs. However, as more flights accumulated, one glaring limitation emerged: altitude. At high altitudes above 15,000 feet, performance dropped dramatically. The Allison engine lacked the power for the Mustang to excel where air combat was fiercest. A solution would be needed. But for now, the Mustang was a promising machine. The Allison V1710 engine, though reliable and robust, was the Achilles heel of the early Mustang. Originally designed for American fighters like the P-40, the engine performed admirably at low and medium altitudes, but suffered badly above 15,000 feet. Its single-stage supercharger could not provide the necessary boost for high-altitude combat, leaving the Mustang underpowered in the very environment where German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 thrived. In Europe, where bomber interceptions and air superiority missions took place at 20,000 to 30,000 feet, this was a crippling limitation. Test pilots in Britain quickly discovered that while the Mustang excelled at low-level speed and maneuverability, it became sluggish and vulnerable when climbing higher. The irony was clear: the most advanced American-designed airframe was hobbled by its engine. Yet at the time, there were few immediate alternatives, and the Mustang's other strengths could not be ignored. At treetop level, it was faster than most fighters, capable of streaking across the landscape at remarkable speed. For reconnaissance and ground attack, the Allison-powered Mustang showed immense promise. Its destiny as a high-altitude escort fighter, however, still lay in the future. Despite its limitations, the RAF eagerly accepted the first production models, designated the Mustang Mach-E, delivered in 1941. These aircraft were armed with a mixed array of .50 caliber Browning machine guns and .30 caliber guns mounted in the wings and nose. RAF test pilots were impressed by its low altitude speed, which outclassed nearly every fighter in their inventory. It was deployed for tactical reconnaissance, low-level bombing, and strafing missions against German targets in France and the Low Countries. Photographic reconnaissance Mustangs scouted enemy defenses with remarkable effectiveness, slipping past German interceptors by flying low and fast. Ground attack missions saw Mustangs rip through rail yards, convoys, and troop concentrations, often returning with bullet holes but still flying. British pilots praised its ruggedness, reporting that it could absorb heavy damage and still bring them home. At these missions, the Mustang Muckacher carved out a reputation as an aggressive, versatile fighter. Yet pilots also warned that it could not tangle with German fighters above the clouds. It was not yet the master of the skies. It was a blade honed for the earthbound fight. American interest in the Mustang began cautiously, with the U.S. Army Air Forces initially skeptical of a fighter designed to British specifications. At first, the P-51 was not considered a priority, with American doctrine still focused on heavy bombers and shorter-range fighter escorts. However, as reports from the RAF came in, enthusiasm grew. The U.S. ordered a limited number of Mustangs for its own use, designating them the P-51A. These early versions carried the same Allison engine and therefore the same altitude limitations. American units primarily employed them for ground attack and photo reconnaissance, where they excelled in speed and precision. In these roles, the Mustang began to carve its name into American wartime experience. Pilots marveled at its handling compared to the P-40, noting how it seemed lighter, faster, and more responsive. Yet the frustration remained. An aircraft with such potential deserved an engine that could unleash it fully. For now, the Allison-powered Mustang was seen as a capable but limited tool. Its legend would have to wait for a transformation. The Mustang's first combat missions with the RAF highlighted both its promise and its shortcomings. In October 1942, Mustang Mach-Is flew in support of Operation Jubilee, the raid on Dieppe. At treetop level, they darted in and out of German defenses, strafing transport vehicles and defensive positions with devastating effect. Their speed at low altitude allowed them to evade interception, confirming their role as outstanding ground attack aircraft. Reconnaissance missions soon followed, with Mustangs mapping German defenses in preparation for future operations. British pilots described them as fast, reliable, and perfectly suited for dangerous low-level flights. However, encounters with German fighters at higher altitudes quickly reminded pilots of their vulnerability. Against Bf-109s above 20,000 feet, the Allison Mustang lagged behind, unable to match climb or sustained power. Many aircraft were lost in these duels, reinforcing the idea that the Mustang needed a better engine. Still, the RAF valued the aircraft, keeping it in frontline service and pushing for upgrades. The Allison Mustang was a fighter with one foot in greatness, but not yet there. Its true destiny remained unrealized. The Allison-powered Mustang became a valuable stopgap, filling roles that freed Spitfires and Hurricanes for higher altitude combat. In doing so, it contributed significantly to the RAF's ability to stretch its limited resources. The Mustang Mach-IA and Mk2 followed, incorporating modifications such as 20 mm Hispano cannons that improved firepower. British squadrons used them for armed reconnaissance, striking targets while photographing enemy positions. Reports noted the Mustang's ability to fly longer and farther than most RAF fighters, making it especially effective in deep penetration missions. The aircraft's low-level speed even allowed it to evade German radar and interceptors, slipping through defenses where other aircraft might fail. For these missions, the Allison Mustang was nearly perfect. It was not the high-altitude savior, but it was a valuable weapon in its own right. For every convoy strafed, every bridge destroyed, and every photograph returned, the Mustang justified its place. Its reputation was growing, though its legend was still incomplete. The world had yet to see the full measure of its power. The early Allison Mustangs were in many ways a paradox, brilliant in design, but constrained by their engines. They revealed the genius of North Americans' engineers, whose aerodynamic innovations gave the Mustang range, speed, and versatility unmatched by contemporaries. Yet they also revealed the limits of American engine technology at the time, with the Allison unable to unlock the Mustang's full potential. In Britain's skies, they proved themselves as fierce ground attackers and recon planes, harassing German positions and gathering intelligence critical to the war effort. Pilots praised their handling, their resilience, and their speed at low levels. But they also cursed their sluggishness when climbing into the clouds to meet German fighters. The Mustang's story, at this stage, was one of promise waiting to be fulfilled. It had entered the war, made its mark, and shown what was possible. The missing piece was power at altitude, and that piece would soon come from a marriage across the Atlantic with the Rolls-Royce Merlin. The Allison Mustangs were the prologue. The legend was only beginning. By the autumn of 1941, the first production Mustangs began crossing the Atlantic under Lend-Lease agreements and RAF orders. Britain, still reeling from years of constant air battle, eagerly awaited this new American fighter, which promised speed, range, and innovation beyond anything in its current arsenal. The aircraft arrived crated, shipped by sea across U-boat-infested waters, and were assembled on British soil before delivery to squadrons. Painted in RAF camouflage, these aircraft were designated Mustang Mach-E, marking the beginning of their European career. British pilots, many hardened by the Battle of Britain, approached the new machine with curiosity and some skepticism. They had seen promises before, aircraft that looked fine on paper but faltered in combat. Yet the Mustang stood out immediately with its sleek lines, broad landing gear, and distinctive radiator scoop. Mechanics praised its design as easy to service, a crucial advantage in war. When RAF test pilots took the Mustang aloft, they discovered a machine that handled smoothly, responded with precision, and flew farther than almost anything in their inventory. The RAF had found a new tool, and it was unlike any fighter they had flown before. From the outset, the Mustang's greatest strength for the RAF was its range. British fighters like the Spitfire were superb dogfighters, unmatched in agility and performance at high altitude, but their endurance was painfully short. They could escort bombers only as far as the French coast before turning back for lack of fuel. The Mustang changed this equation. With its efficient laminar flow wing and excellent fuel economy, it could fly deeper into enemy territory, scout German positions, and return with intelligence. The RAF quickly realized that while it might lack high-altitude performance against the Bev 109, it was ideal for reconnaissance. Equipped with cameras in its fuselage and wings, the Mustang Mach-E became one of the Allies' most effective eyes in the sky. It mapped coastal defenses, railways, bridges, and airfields, information vital for planning bombing raids and ground operations. For British commanders, the Mustang was a revelation. They finally had a fighter that could range far, fly fast, and bring back intelligence that no bomber or slower aircraft could provide. It was a weapon of vision as much as of firepower. The RAF also quickly recognized the Mustang's value as a low-level ground attacker. Unlike the Spitfire, which was vulnerable when diving into strafing runs, The Mustang was stable, rugged, and extremely fast at treetop level. Armed with 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns and 4.30 caliber weapons, it unleashed a devastating curtain of fire against trains, convoys, and troop columns. Its speed made it difficult for German flak crews to target, and its durability often brought pilots home even after sustaining hits. Squadrons were tasked with attacking German supply lines in occupied France and the Low Countries, and the Mustang excelled in this dangerous role. Pilots skimmed hedgerows, dodging telegraph poles and bursting through flak zones to shred locomotives and trucks with withering fire. The psychological effect was immense. German troops began to dread the sudden roar of an unseen Mustang racing overhead. The aircraft's ability to combine reconnaissance with attack made it doubly valuable, photographing enemy positions on one mission, destroying them the next. For the RAF, the Mustang Mach-I was proving indispensable. It was not just another fighter, it was a new kind of battlefield predator. The Mustang's first large-scale combat test came during the Dieppe Raid in August 1942, a combined operation that threw Allied forces against the heavily fortified French coast. Alongside Spitfires, Hurricanes, and bombers, Mustangs were deployed for low-level reconnaissance and ground attack. Flying just above the waves, they swept inland to strafe German positions, hitting gun emplacements, convoys, and communications. Though the raid itself was a costly failure for the Allies, the Mustang's performance stood out. Pilots reported that the aircraft handled brilliantly at low altitude, striking targets and escaping before German fighters could intervene. Reconnaissance photographs taken by Mustangs provided invaluable lessons for future operations, showing how German defenses were layered along the French coast. Losses were suffered, but the Mustang had proven its worth. In the bloody aftermath of Dieppe, Allied commanders noted that while much had gone wrong, the new American fighter had performed beyond expectations. It had done exactly what was asked of it, and it had survived where others might not. British evaluations of the Mustang were detailed and often glowing, though they did not shy away from criticism. Reports emphasized that below 15,000 feet, the Mustang was one of the fastest aircraft in service. At these levels, it could outrun almost anything the Luftwaffe could send against it. Its handling was praised as forgiving, with good roll rates and stability in dives. However, once pushed higher into the thin air of combat altitudes, its Allison engine revealed its shortcomings. The Bf 109 and F1 190 could outclimb and outfight it above the clouds, leaving Mustang pilots vulnerable if caught in the wrong environment. For this reason, British doctrine assigned the Mustang to missions that exploited its strengths and avoided its weaknesses. Reconnaissance, low-level attack, and tactical support became its specialties, and in these roles it excelled. The RAF appreciated its ruggedness. Many pilots returned with bullet holes in their wings and fuselage, their aircraft battered but still flying. The verdict was clear. The Mustang Mach-I was not perfect, but it was indispensable, and with refinement it could be even more. Pilots who flew the Mustang Mach-I often spoke of the sense of power and freedom it gave them. Compared to the cramped Spitfire, the cockpit felt spacious, with clear visibility over the nose and wings. The wide landing gear gave confidence on takeoff and landing, reducing the accidents that plagued other aircraft. Its speed at low level gave pilots the initiative, allowing them to dictate the terms of engagement in ground attack missions. They described the thrill of racing over fields and forests, the blur of the ground below, and the sudden chaos as trains or convoys erupted under their guns. Many compared it to a racing car, smooth yet aggressive, demanding skill but rewarding mastery. For reconnaissance pilots, the Mustang was equally valued. Its stability at speed made for sharp, clear photographs, critical for intelligence officers planning bombing raids. In a war where knowledge was as vital as firepower, the Mustang offered both. It became a pilot's aircraft, loved for its handling, respected for its power, and trusted to bring them home. It was a rare combination, and it made the Mustang unforgettable. The Mustang mech I was also a symbol of transatlantic cooperation, a marriage of British need and American ingenuity. It had been ordered by the RAF, designed by North American Aviation, and powered by an Allison engine that reflected America's growing industrial might. The sight of Mustangs flying alongside Spitfires was a powerful reminder of the alliance forming between Britain and the United States. These aircraft carried British roundels, but their bones and heart were American. In many ways, they foreshadowed the larger collaboration that would define the Allied war effort, sharing resources, technology, and sacrifice to defeat a common enemy. The Mustang became a tangible link between the two nations, a weapon forged by urgency and trust. British pilots came to respect the American fighter, and American engineers learned valuable lessons from British combat feedback. Out of this collaboration, the Mustang's future would be shaped. The RAF had given it a proving ground, and the Allies had given it purpose. Together they had created a foundation for one of history's greatest fighters. By the end of 1942, the Mustang mech I had carved out a distinct identity within the RAF. It was the fast, long-legged scout, the low-level raider, the trainbuster, and the eye in the sky for Allied planners. It was not yet the high-altitude escort that would one day define it, but it had already earned respect and admiration. The aircraft's combination of speed, versatility, and ruggedness made it one of the most effective tactical fighters of the early war years. For British commanders, it had proven its value for pilots, it had proven its reliability, and for the Allies as a whole, it hinted at greater possibilities. The Mustang's journey from California's drawing boards to Britain's skies had been swift and dramatic. It had gone from a desperate gamble to a reliable weapon in just over a year. Its legend was growing, one mission at a time, and soon, with a new engine, that legend would reach the skies it was always meant to conquer. The Mustang's destiny was only beginning to unfold. The Allison-powered Mustang was a remarkable aircraft with a fatal flaw. It excelled at low altitudes, where speed and agility gave it superiority, but as it climbed toward the battle altitudes of Europe, its strength faded. German fighters, like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf Theo 190, reigned supreme above 20,000 feet, where air combat was most often decided. The Mustang, for all its aerodynamic brilliance, was held back by an engine that could not breathe thin, high-altitude air. The Allison V1710, reliable though it was, simply lacked the supercharging power required for sustained performance above the clouds. British test pilots and engineers, frustrated by this limitation, began to ask an obvious question: what if this airframe, so advanced and efficient, were paired with a different engine? Across the Atlantic, the answer was already waiting: the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin. The same engine that had given the Spitfire and Hurricane their teeth in the Battle of Britain was now considered as a transplant for the Mustang. It was an audacious idea, but one that promised to unlock the fighter's full potential. The stage was set for one of the most important marriages in aviation history. The Merlin engine was already a legend in its own right. Developed by Rolls-Royce in Britain, it was a liquid-cooled V12 masterpiece, delivering power smoothly across a wide range of altitudes. What made it transformative was its two-stage, two-speed supercharger, which forced air into the engine, even in the thin atmosphere of high altitudes. This meant that a Merlin-powered fighter could climb higher, faster, and maintain power where other engines faltered. The Spitfire had demonstrated this to devastating effect in the Battle of Britain, when Merlin engines gave RAF pilots the edge over German invaders. Now, engineers imagined the sleek aerodynamic Mustang airframe married to the raw power and altitude performance of the Merlin. On paper, the combination promised a leap in performance unmatched by any other Allied fighter. The Mustang's efficient wing and cooling system would complement the Merlin's power, potentially creating a machine with both range and altitude dominance. It was more than an upgrade. It was the possibility of perfection. The challenge was to make the idea reality, and British engineers were ready to try. In 1942, at Rolls-Royce's experimental facility at Hucknall, Nottinghamshire, the first Merlin was fitted to a Mustang airframe. The result was known as the Mustang X, an experimental hybrid designed to test whether theory could become practice. Engineers faced challenges, mounting, cooling, balance, but the fit was remarkably smooth, as though the airframe had been waiting for this engine all along. When test pilots took the Merlin Mustang aloft, the difference was immediate and dramatic. The aircraft soared past 30,000 feet with ease, maintaining power and speed that the Allison could never achieve. At high altitude, it matched and even surpassed the performance of Germany's finest fighters. Speeds exceeded 430 miles per hour, climb rates improved significantly, and handling remained superb. Pilots emerged from the cockpit amazed, declaring it a different aircraft altogether, a fighter reborn. The transformation was undeniable. The Mustang was no longer limited to skimming the treetops. It could now rule the skies. The Merlin had given wings to a legend. News of the Merlin Mustang spread rapidly through both British and American channels. The RAF immediately recognized its potential as a true high-altitude escort and pressed for development. At the same time, the U.S. Army Air Forces, previously lukewarm about the Allison Mustang, began to take serious notice. The idea that bombers could be escorted all the way to Berlin and back suddenly seemed possible. The American bombing campaign, plagued by heavy losses due to lack of long-range escorts, now had a potential savior. Engineers refined the design further, incorporating the Packard-built Merlin engine, manufactured under license in the United States. These engines, known as the Packard V1650, were virtually identical to Rolls-Royce's, but produced on an industrial scale. With American production muscle behind it, the Merlin Mustang could be produced in numbers sufficient to change the war. The designation would become P-51B and P-51C, the first true Mustangs as history would remember them. What had begun as a British experiment was now an Allied revolution. The miracle was spreading. The performance of the Merlin Mustang was nothing short of revolutionary. With drop tanks fitted, its range stretched beyond 1,600 miles, making it the longest-legged fighter of the war. It could escort bombers from English airfields deep into Germany, over targets like Berlin, Leipzig, and even as far as Munich, then return safely. At high altitude, it could engage German interceptors head-on, matching their climb, speed, and agility. Pilots described it as a Spitfire with legs, combining the nimbleness of Britain's best fighter with the endurance of a long-distance machine. For bomber crews, the sight of Mustangs forming up alongside their formations meant hope, safety, and survival. Luftwaffe pilots, once confident in their ability to ravage unescorted bombers, now faced a nightmare. The hunters had become the hunted. In combat trials, Mustangs equipped with Merlins proved devastating, shooting down German fighters with increasing regularity. The balance of the air war began to shift visibly. The Merlin had transformed the Mustang into the ultimate weapon, and its legend was just beginning to spread across the skies of Europe. The impact of the Merlin Mustang rippled far beyond the test fields and into the strategic heart of the Allied war effort. For years, American doctrine had insisted on daylight precision bombing, believing that unescorted bombers could fight their way to targets with defensive firepower. Reality proved far harsher, as B-17 and B-24 formations suffered appalling losses when left unprotected over Germany. The introduction of the Merlin Mustang changed this calculus entirely. Now, bomber streams could be shielded by fast, long-range escorts capable of challenging any Luftwaffe fighter. The air war shifted from a costly gamble to a calculated campaign of destruction. Factories, oil refineries, rail hubs and aircraft plants that had once been safe behind the Luftwaffe's shield were now within reach. The Merlin Mustang was not just a tactical success, it was a strategic revolution. By enabling bombers to survive and strike deep, it crippled the German war machine at its heart. The miracle of the Merlin was not only about performance, it was about victory itself. Pilots who transitioned from the Allison to the Merlin Mustang often described it as stepping into a new world. The power, the climb, the responsiveness all felt transformed, as though the same airframe had been given new life. Squadron reports brimmed with enthusiasm, noting not only the Mustang's improved combat performance, but also its reliability and ease of operation. In combat, Mustangs could now climb to meet BAF 109S and F-190S at altitude, fight them on even terms, and still return home with fuel to spare. The marriage of British engineering and American design had created the perfect fighter for the conditions of the European air war. Stories spread of Mustangs outrunning enemies, diving into dogfights with confidence, and returning from missions that once would have spelled disaster. Luftwaffe veterans admitted grudging respect for the new opponent, recognizing that the balance of the skies had shifted. For Mustang pilots, flying with a Merlin was more than a duty, it was a joy. They knew they were flying not just a fighter, but a masterpiece. And they carried that confidence into battle. The Rolls-Royce Merlin transformed the Mustang from a promising aircraft into a legend. It took a design born of urgency and elevated it into the greatest piston engine fighter of the war. The combination of range, speed, agility, and altitude performance had never before been achieved in one machine. More than just an upgrade, it was a rebirth, the moment when the Mustang became the fighter that crushed the Luftwaffe. This transformation was a triumph of Allied cooperation, British ingenuity, and American industry working together to create a weapon that could not be stopped. The Mustang's destiny, once limited to low-level roles, was rewritten. It would now soar with bombers over Germany, tangle with the best of the Luftwaffe, and emerge victorious. Every flight of the Merlin Mustang told the story of innovation, persistence, and collaboration under fire. It was the miracle that turned the tide of the air war. And from this moment on, the Mustang was not just another fighter, it was history's greatest. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine had proven the concept, but it was the production models, the P-51B and P-51C, that brought the Mustang into history as a weapon of war. With Packard producing Merlin engines under license in the United States, mass production could now match demand. North American Aviation adapted the airframe, refining it to carry the Packard V1653 engine, delivering over 1,400 horsepower at altitude. The sleek fuselage, laminar flow wing, and belly radiator scoop remained, but now every line of the aircraft was backed by the power to climb and fight above 30,000 feet. The P-51B and its twin, the P-51C, were virtually identical, differing only in production location: Inglewood, California, for the B model, and Dallas, Texas for the C. Together they represented the first true Mustangs, the definitive high-altitude fighters that the Allies had been waiting for. These models carried 4.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each with 350 rounds, providing devastating firepower against enemy aircraft. Their speed now exceeded 440 miles per hour, with excellent maneuverability and acceleration. What had begun as a desperate experiment was now a frontline fighter ready to enter the crucible of Europe's skies. The Mustang was no longer a promise, it was reality. The arrival of the P-51B/C coincided with a crisis in the American bombing campaign. US doctrine had insisted on daylight precision bombing, striking factories, oil refineries, and transportation hubs deep in Germany. Yet without long-range escorts, bomber losses were catastrophic. Missions to Bremen, Regensburg, and Schweinfurt had resulted in hundreds of B-17S and B-24S being shot down, their crews killed or captured. Morale among bomber groups plummeted, and questions arose about whether daylight raids could even continue. Then came the Mustang. With external drop tanks slung under its wings, the P-51B could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and beyond. Suddenly, formations of flying fortresses and liberators were no longer alone over Germany. They were joined by fast, lethal Mustangs ready to duel the Luftwaffe. For bomber crews, the change was life-saving. For the Luftwaffe, it was devastating. The P-51B and C models entered combat in late 1943, and within months the air war over Europe began to shift. The weapon that had been missing was finally in the fight. Technically, the P-51B/C was a marvel of balance and efficiency. Its Packard Merlin engine gave it not only speed, but also sustained performance across a wide range of altitudes. At 25,000 feet, it could match or surpass the Bf 109G and FW190A, two of the Luftwaffe's deadliest opponents. Its dive speed was exceptional, allowing pilots to break off combat safely or pursue enemies with deadly momentum. The laminar flow wing, while delicate to manufacture, reduced drag and gave the Mustang unmatched range and efficiency. Engineers also strengthened the airframe to handle the additional stresses of high-altitude combat and long escort missions. The cockpit was outfitted with improved instrumentation, though its visibility remained restricted by the framed canopy, a weakness pilots noted. Still, compared to any other Allied fighter of the time, the P-51B and C offered an unprecedented combination of range, speed, and firepower. The Mustang was not perfect, but in the brutal arithmetic of war, it was perfect enough. And perfection enough was all the Allies needed to change the outcome. The Mustang's combat debut in Europe was swift and dramatic. In December 1943, the first P-51B squadrons joined the 8th Air Force's long-range escort missions over Germany. Their arrival was timed with Operation Argument, better known as Big Week, in February 1944. During this campaign, American bombers launched massive raids against German aircraft factories, with Mustang escorts protecting them all the way to the targets. Luftwaffe fighters rose to meet them, expecting to find bombers vulnerable as before. Instead, they found themselves ambushed by swarms of P-51Bs diving from altitude, engaging with speed and ferocity. German pilots quickly realized this was no P-47 Thunderbolt or P-38 Lightning. They were facing a machine that could chase them into the clouds and outlast them in combat. The Mustang's kill ratios soared, and bomber losses dropped significantly. For the first time, the US strategic bombing campaign became viable. The Mustang had arrived in Europe, and its impact was immediate. The Luftwaffe was no longer the hunter, it was the hunted. For the pilots who flew the P-51B/C, the aircraft was a revelation. Many had cut their teeth on P-38s or P-47s, both effective but with limitations, either range or performance. When they strapped into a Mustang, they discovered a fighter that felt like an extension of themselves. Its controls were light and responsive, its acceleration thrilling, and its endurance liberating. Pilots could fly deep into Germany, fight running battles with enemy interceptors, and still have the fuel to return home. The psychological effect was profound. No longer did they feel like they were flying on borrowed time, always calculating whether fuel or enemy fighters would doom them. Instead, they entered combat with confidence, knowing their machine could meet anything the Luftwaffe sent. Veteran ace Don Blakesley, commander of the 4th Fighter Group, famously declared, "The Mustang is the plane we've been waiting for." Pilots across the 8th and 9th Air Forces echoed the sentiment. The Mustang B and C were more than fighters. They were lifelines. And with them the tide was turning. The Luftwaffe responded with desperation. German pilots, many seasoned veterans from the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front, were stunned by the Mustang's arrival. The Bf-109 and FW-190, once dominant, suddenly faced a rival that could match them in climb, exceed them in dive, and chase them for hundreds of miles. The Germans attempted new tactics, massing formations to overwhelm bomber groups, but the Mustangs broke them apart with coordinated attacks. As losses mounted, the Luftwaffe's pool of experienced aces dwindled. By spring 1944, attrition was hollowing out Germany's once feared fighter arm. For every bomber destroyed, the Germans lost fighters at an unsustainable rate. The Mustang was not only protecting bombers, it was destroying the Luftwaffe itself. German civilians, once comforted by the hum of fighters overhead, now watched helplessly as Mustangs prowled the skies even above their cities. The Reich's shield was cracking, and the Mustang's role was undeniable. The Bf and C models were not just machines, they were the instruments of a shifting war. Strategically, the P-51B and C transformed the air war from a defensive struggle into an offensive campaign. With long-range escort secured, the Allies could bomb factories in Regensburg, aircraft plants in Augsburg, oil refineries in Ploiești, and rail yards across the Reich. The Luftwaffe's ability to contest these raids weakened month by month, as fuel shortages and pilot losses mounted. Mustangs did not just guard bombers, they actively sought out enemy fighters, roaming ahead of the bomber streams to sweep the skies clear. This fighter sweep tactic became devastating. As German squadrons were forced into combat they could not win. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was losing the initiative entirely. What had once been daring raids deep into Germany became systematic destruction. The Mustang had made daylight bombing sustainable, which in turn crippled German industry and production. By the time D-Day arrived in June 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. The B and C models had done their work. They had cleared the skies for invasion. The P-51, B and C represented the Mustang's coming of age, the moment when potential became reality. They were not flawless. The cockpit canopy restricted visibility, gun jams were not uncommon, and engine reliability was still being refined. But in the sum of their parts, they were unmatched. They combined range, speed, firepower, and altitude performance in a way no other fighter of the war could claim. Their arrival marked the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe, turning Germany's once mighty air force into a bleeding, exhausted shadow. For the Allies, they brought not only victory in the skies, but also the morale needed to sustain the bombing campaign and prepare for invasion. For pilots, they were machines to be loved, trusted, and fought with pride. And for history, they were the first true Mustangs, the aircraft that defined the air war in Europe. With the B and C models, the legend was secure, and the path to victory was open. By late 1943, the US Army Air Forces faced a crisis in its air war against Germany. American doctrine had insisted that daylight precision bombing would cripple the enemy's industry and bring victory faster than night raids. But without long-range fighter escort, formations of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators were flying into death traps. German fighters rose in massed swarms to meet them, tearing apart the slow-moving bombers with merciless efficiency. At Schweinfurt and Regensburg, entire waves of bombers were decimated, losses reaching nearly a quarter of the aircraft launched. Morale plummeted as aircrews faced missions with odds that seemed suicidal. Even the most determined commanders questioned whether daylight bombing could continue. The 8th Air Force needed a savior, a weapon that could protect bombers from takeoff to target and back again. That weapon arrived in the form of the P-51 Mustang. With its long-range, high-speed, and altitude performance, it could finally escort bombers deep into the Reich. The doctrine of daylight bombing, once on the brink of collapse, was about to be redeemed by wings of silver. The concept of escort missions was not new, but the Mustang revolutionized how they were executed. Earlier escorts like the P-47 Thunderbolt and P-38 Lightning were formidable in combat, but lacked the range to accompany bombers all the way to Berlin or beyond. The Mustang, with its laminar flow wing and external drop tanks, could fly over 1,600 miles, escorting bombers to their deepest targets and still return home. This meant that for the first time, bomber crews were not abandoned at the most dangerous part of their mission. Instead, Mustangs remained with them, weaving in protective formations, ready to pounce on enemy fighters. Escort missions became a ballet of coordination, with P-51s forming an outer shield around bomber groups. German interceptors that once charged confidently into bomber formations now found themselves intercepted, harassed, and destroyed before they could even reach their prey. For American commanders, the Mustang made daylight bombing feasible again. For German pilots, it was a nightmare in polished aluminum. The balance of the air war was shifting, and the Mustang was at its center. A typical escort mission was a grueling test of endurance and nerve. Mustangs would rendezvous with bomber groups over England, climbing into formation, and then stretching across the Channel toward occupied Europe. Once over enemy territory, tension mounted. Luftwaffe ground controllers tracked the incoming waves, vectoring fighters to intercept. Before the Mustang, these moments were terrifying for bomber crews, who knew that German fighters would arrive in minutes and tear through their squadrons. Now Mustangs raced ahead, diving into enemy formations, scattering them before they reached the bombers. Pilots engaged in twisting dogfights above the contrails, their guns spitting streams of .50 caliber fire into Bleif 109s and Furv 190s. Below, bombers held steady, their defensive gunners cheering as silver Mustangs streaked past, chasing Germans into the clouds. These escorts were not passive guardians, they were aggressive hunters. The doctrine evolved from mere defense to air dominance, with Mustangs seeking out and destroying the Luftwaffe wherever it appeared. It was not just protection, it was extermination. The psychological impact on bomber crews was immense. For months they had flown missions knowing that survival was a coin toss at best. Crews referred to their aircraft as flying coffins, with each sortie bringing them closer to death or capture. The sight of Mustangs forming up alongside their formations changed everything. Airmen described the feeling as relief, hope, and renewed determination. Knowing they were not alone in enemy skies lifted morale dramatically. Letters home began to mention the little friends who watched over them, a nickname bomber crews gave to their fighter escorts. Stories spread of Mustangs diving to save crippled bombers, of pilots sacrificing themselves to drive off attackers, of camaraderie forged in the deadly arena of the sky. For bomber crews, the Mustang was not just another plane, it was salvation. Its very presence gave them courage to press on, to fly deeper, to strike harder. Daylight bombing could now continue, sustained by confidence as much as protection, and that confidence was built on the wings of the Mustang. The Luftwaffe, once feared as the scourge of the skies, now found itself in a desperate struggle. Its tactics of massed interception, once devastating, became increasingly costly against Mustang escorts. German pilots attempted head-on attacks, hoping to break bomber formations quickly, but Mustangs met them in fierce counterattacks. Attrition began to take its toll. Veteran German aces, irreplaceable in skill and experience, were lost in mounting numbers. The Luftwaffe tried introducing newer aircraft like the Bf 109 G6 and later the Fed 190D, but even these could not decisively counter the Mustang. Fuel shortages compounded the problem, limiting training for new pilots and grounding squadrons altogether. By early 1944, German commanders admitted privately that their fighter arm was being bled dry. The Luftwaffe's aura of invincibility had been shattered. Every sortie became riskier, every loss harder to replace. The skies over Germany were no longer safe havens, they had become hunting grounds for the Mustang. The Mustang's effectiveness forced a rethinking of strategic air war doctrine. Before its arrival, daylight bombing had been questioned at the highest levels, with some arguing it should be abandoned in favor of British-style night raids. With the Mustang in escort, American doctrine was vindicated. Precision bombing could now be carried out at scale, striking oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, synthetic fuel factories, and aircraft production facilities. These raids crippled Germany's industrial capacity and eroded its ability to sustain war. The Mustang enabled not just survival but dominance, allowing bombers to press deeper and hit harder than ever before. It turned daylight bombing from a gamble into a systematic campaign of destruction. Historians later argued that without the Mustang, the strategic bombing offensive might have failed. With it, the Allies could strangle Germany's war machine from above. The doctrine had found its proof. The Mustang had made it possible. Escort missions evolved into something even more aggressive, the fighter sweep. Instead of waiting passively by the bombers, Mustang groups often surged ahead into enemy airspace, sweeping the skies clean of German fighters before they could even approach. This tactic devastated the Luftwaffe, forcing them into combat on unfavorable terms. The Mustang's range allowed these sweeps to continue far beyond what any other fighter could attempt. Combined with bomber escort, the result was relentless pressure. German fighters were either destroyed in the air, caught on the ground, or forced into defensive maneuvers that left the bombers unchallenged. By spring 1944, Luftwaffe squadrons were being ground down daily. Some German units reported losses of 30 to 40% in a single engagement. The Mustang had shifted the air war from a defensive struggle to an offensive campaign of annihilation. Escorting bombers was no longer just about protection. It was about breaking the enemy entirely. The Mustang had become both shield and sword. The introduction of the Mustang into escort duty was a turning point not just in the air war, but in the war itself. It ensured the survival of the daylight bombing campaign, which in turn crippled German industry and paved the way for invasion. It destroyed the Luftwaffe as an effective fighting force, leaving the skies open for Allied dominance, and it gave courage to thousands of airmen who had once faced hopeless odds. Escort missions became the proving ground where the Mustang earned its reputation. Battle by battle, sortie by sortie, its silver wings stretched across Europe, a constant reminder that the Allies now owned the skies. The Mustang did not just escort bombers, it transformed strategy, morale, and the balance of power. It was the weapon that gave air supremacy to the Allies and brought Germany's war machine to its knees. In the story of daylight bombing, the Mustang was not a supporting character, it was the star, and its legend was only growing stronger with every mission flown. The Mustang's entry into combat over Europe placed it against an enemy that had once ruled the skies, the Luftwaffe. German fighter pilots had cut their teeth in the Spanish Civil War, honed their skills over Poland, France, and Britain, and fought relentlessly over the vast expanses of the Soviet Union. They were experienced, disciplined, and flying some of the most advanced machines of the war. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, Germany's workhorse fighter, had been continually upgraded since 1937, remaining a deadly opponent even in 1943 and 1944. Its climb rate and acceleration made it a formidable adversary in dogfights. The Focke-Wulf 190, introduced in 1941, brought brutal firepower and rugged design, feared by Allied pilots for its versatility and deadly armament. Against these machines, the Mustang would have to prove its worth, not on paper, but in the brutal arithmetic of combat. Luftwaffe aces, many with dozens or even hundreds of kills, believed they could still dominate. The challenge was clear. Could the Mustang truly defeat Germany's finest fighters? The answer would come in fire, steel, and sacrifice. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 remained the Luftwaffe's backbone, sleek, lightweight, and deadly in skilled hands. By 1943, the G-series, known as the Gustav, was the most common variant in combat. It boasted a powerful Daimler-Benz DB 605 engine, armed with a 20 mm or even 30 mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, and machine guns mounted in the nose. Its climb rate was superb, allowing it to pounce on enemy formations with vertical maneuvers. In the hands of veterans, the Bf 109 was a lethal dueling machine, capable of tearing apart bombers or fighters alike. But by this stage of the war, it also showed limitations. Its narrow landing gear made it difficult to handle on takeoff and landing, and its cockpit visibility was poor compared to Allied fighters. Against the Mustang, the Bf 109 could still win in one-on-one fights, especially with a skilled pilot. Yet sustained combat revealed the truth. The Mustang's range, firepower, and high-altitude performance gave it the edge. It was not about single duels. It was about dominating the skies over thousands of miles, and here the Mustang proved superior. The Focke-Wulf F 190 presented a different kind of challenge. Heavier and more rugged than the Bf 109, it was powered by a BMW 801 radial engine, delivering high speed and brutal firepower, armed with two 20 mm cannons and machine guns in its standard versions, and later upgraded with four 20 mm cannons or even 30 mm weapons. It could shred bombers in seconds. Its wide landing gear made it stable and forgiving on takeoff, and its cockpit gave better visibility than the Bf 109. Allied pilots initially feared the FW 190, calling it superior to anything they had when it first appeared. But the Mustang's arrival changed the balance. With its higher speed, superior range, and ability to fight at altitude, it could now meet the FW-190 on equal terms. In prolonged engagements, the Mustang's agility and endurance often wore down the heavier German fighter. The FW-190 was still dangerous, particularly in hit-and-run tactics, but it could no longer dominate the skies as it once had. The Mustang had taken away its aura of invincibility. What truly set the Mustang apart was not just how it compared in isolated performance, but how it fought in the broader air war. The Luftwaffe had been built around the principle of short-range tactical supremacy, flying from bases close to the front lines. Its fighters were optimized for quick climbs, sharp bursts of combat, and rapid returns to base. The Mustang, by contrast, was built for endurance. It could loiter for hours over bomber streams, sweep ahead to ambush interceptors, and pursue fleeing enemies deep into German airspace. Luftwaffe pilots often found themselves outnumbered, low on fuel, and fighting against enemies who seemed tireless. Even when Bf-109S or F-WED-190S outclimbed or outturned a Mustang briefly, the Americans could disengage, regroup, and return, while Germans had to conserve fuel and ammunition. Sustained combat exposed the weakness of the Luftwaffe's design philosophy. The Mustang was not just a fighter, it was an air superiority system, designed to maintain dominance for hours, not minutes. Against this, even Germany's best machines began to falter. The human element of the Luftwaffe challenge cannot be ignored. German pilots in 1943 still included some of the most skilled aces in history. Men like Erich Hartmann, Gerhard Barkhorn, and Günther Rall. Many had over 100 victories, some exceeding 200, their experience forged over years of near-constant combat. Against them, American pilots were often younger and less experienced, flying their first missions into enemy skies. Yet the Mustang's qualities gave these new pilots a fighting chance. Its stability in combat, its excellent visibility compared to German fighters, and its forgiving handling allowed rookies to survive and learn. Over time, the attrition of constant combat wore down the Luftwaffe's aces, replacing them with inexperienced pilots who could not match Allied training or numbers. The Mustang accelerated this decline, killing veterans and crushing replacements alike. In the end, even skill could not overcome exhaustion, shortages, and overwhelming Allied presence. The Luftwaffe faced not just a machine, but an entire system of production, training, and relentless pressure. The Mustang was its sharpest edge. Combat reports reveal the deadly chess match between Mustangs and German fighters. Luftwaffe pilots often tried to use altitude advantage, diving from above into bomber formations, but Mustang groups positioned themselves higher, ready to intercept in coordinated fashion. Dogfights spiraled across the sky, with contrails marking violent turns and gunfire flashing like sparks in a storm. Mustangs relied on teamwork, flying in disciplined pairs and squadrons, while German pilots increasingly fought alone or in small, desperate groups. The American doctrine of mutual support reduced losses and increased kills. Bomber crews, watching the battles unfold around them, described the sight of Mustangs tearing into German formations as exhilarating and terrifying. Wrecks of Bf 109 says and FALV 190 says fell burning through the clouds, chased by Mustang fire. The Luftwaffe still struck hard, still killed bombers and escorts, but the balance was tipping. For every Mustang lost, several German fighters fell, and Germany could not replace them fast enough. The duel in the skies was becoming a war of attrition, and the Mustang was winning. The arrival of the Mustang also changed the morale equation on both sides. For the Allies, confidence soared. Pilots spoke of finally having a machine that could take them to the heart of Germany and back, fighting every mile of the way. Bomber crews, once resigned to dreadful losses, now looked for the glint of Mustangs overhead and felt hope. On the German side, despair crept in. Civilians who once trusted the Luftwaffe's protection now watched Allied bombers appear in daylight, shielded by fighters the Luftwaffe could not stop. German pilots, many fighting until fuel or ammunition ran out, admitted privately that they could no longer control the skies. The Mustang had stolen the Luftwaffe's greatest advantage, psychological dominance. The hunter had become the hunted, and the change was irreversible. Each mission reinforced the reality that Germany's air force was bleeding to death, and the Mustang was the instrument of that bleed. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe challenge had been decisively met. The Bf 109 and F 190, once symbols of air supremacy, were reduced to defensive tools, fighting hopeless battles against superior numbers, superior range, and increasingly superior machines. The Mustang did not win every duel. Many American pilots died in the skies over Germany, but it won the war of endurance. It ensured bombers reached their targets, it wore down the Luftwaffe day after day, and it established Allied control of the air. The legend of the Mustang was forged in these duels, not in isolated statistics, but in the cumulative effect of sustained superiority. German fighters remained deadly, but they were fighting on borrowed time. The Mustang had outlasted them, outpaced them, and outproduced them. By the time D-Day arrived, the Luftwaffe was broken, its strength shattered by relentless Mustang assaults. The challenge had been answered, and the skies over Europe now belonged to the Allies. By early 1944, the Allied air war over Europe had reached a critical stage. The bombing campaign against Germany was intensifying, but without destroying the Luftwaffe, no invasion of France could succeed. German fighters continued to inflict heavy losses on bomber streams, and without air superiority, the planned cross-channel assault, Operation Overlord, would be suicide. The solution was bold, brutal, and all-encompassing, a concentrated assault designed to cripple the Luftwaffe once and for all. This operation was code-named Argument, but it would go down in history as Big Week. For 6 days in February 1944, the US 8th and 15th Air Forces launched massive raids against German aircraft factories, supply depots, and assembly plants. These were not token strikes, but systematic efforts to cripple fighter production at its source. The stakes were immense. If successful, Big Week would shatter Germany's ability to replace lost fighters and open the skies for invasion. If it failed, Allied losses could cripple the bombing campaign entirely. The stage was set for the ultimate test of daylight bombing, and the Mustang was at its heart. The plan for Big Week was ambitious and unforgiving. Bomber formations would target Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf factories across Germany, striking facilities in Leipzig, Augsburg, Regensburg, and beyond. They would also hit critical ball-bearing plants, fuel depots, and transport hubs. The goal was twofold: destroy aircraft production and force the Luftwaffe into battle, where attrition would grind it down. This was not simply about hitting factories, it was about drawing the enemy into the air, where the Mustangs waited. Every mission was designed to provoke, to dare the Luftwaffe to rise in defense of its vital industry, and rise it did. Hundreds of German fighters scrambled each day, rushing to intercept the bomber streams thundering across the Reich. For the Allies, this was exactly what they wanted. Every Bf 109 or F-Wef 190 destroyed over Germany was one less defending against D-Day. Big Week was not just a bombing campaign, it was a trap, one baited with steel and blood, and the Luftwaffe took the bait. The skies over Germany during Big Week became a cauldron of fire and chaos. Bomber formations stretched for miles, dozens of B-17 Psy and B-24 Psy flying wingtip to wingtip, bristling with guns. Above and around them, P-51 Mustangs prowled, darting in and out of formation, scanning the horizon for German interceptors. Then, like hawks, the Luftwaffe descended. Beef 109s dove from above, cannons blazing, while F-Fluv 190 SES slashed in from the sides, firing into bomber formations with devastating bursts. Yet the Mustangs were ready. Diving to intercept, they met the Germans head-on, breaking up attacks before they could reach the bombers. Dogfights spiraled through contrails, black puffs of flak punctuating the sky. Engines roared, guns chattered, and planes burned, falling in flaming arcs toward the earth. For pilots, the battles were sensory overload, smoke, fire, and the constant hammer of machine guns. It was war in its most concentrated, brutal form, and it raged every day of Big Week. For the Luftwaffe, Big Week was a disaster unfolding in slow motion. Forced to defend critical factories, German fighters rose in massed numbers, often several hundred in a single day. But for every attack, the Mustangs were there, relentless, aggressive, and unyielding. American pilots hunted with ruthless efficiency, cutting down German interceptors before they could strike the bomber formations. Losses mounted at an unsustainable pace. The Luftwaffe's veteran aces, many with years of experience, were now being outnumbered and outflown. Replacement pilots, hastily trained and thrown into combat, fared even worse, often killed on their very first missions. Factories that survived the raids found themselves short of pilots to fly the aircraft they produced. Germany's Air Force, once the terror of Europe, was being bled dry. Big Week was not a single crushing blow, but a sustained hemorrhage. And the Mustang was the scalpel cutting deepest. The results on the ground were devastating. At Leipzig and Regensburg, key Messerschmitt assembly plants were hit, slowing production of the Bf 109. At Gotha, the only facility producing Focke-Wulf's twin-engine Me 210 was destroyed. Augsburg, another critical center, was bombed heavily, disrupting the output of fighter aircraft. Repair shops, engine factories, and transportation lines were shattered, leaving Germany scrambling to rebuild. Though German industry was resilient and capable of dispersing production, the sheer scale of destruction during Big Week crippled output for months. At the same time, the constant losses of pilots meant that even planes produced could not be flown effectively. The Mustang's protection ensured that bombers could reach these targets repeatedly without prohibitive losses. The combination was lethal: factories in ruins, assembly lines disrupted, and the Luftwaffe itself decimated in combat. Big Week was achieving its purpose. It was dismantling Germany's ability to wage air war, and it was doing so at the very moment the Allies needed it most. For the bomber crews, Big Week was a test of endurance like no other. Missions often lasted over 8 hours, with hours spent flying in formation, enduring flak and fighter attacks. The losses were still heavy. Dozens of bombers were destroyed in some raids, but the difference was clear. With Mustangs at their side, survival was no longer a desperate gamble. Crews reported watching P-51s dive into German fighters, scattering them before they could make sustained attacks. For many, the memory of Mustangs streaking past in defense became the defining image of the campaign. Letters and diaries from airmen speak of gratitude bordering on reverence for their escorts. They called the Mustangs our angels and our little friends, knowing that without them Big Week might have ended in catastrophe. The bombers bore the weight of destruction, but the Mustangs carried the burden of survival. Together they broke the Luftwaffe, and together they cleared the path to invasion. The impact of Big Week rippled far beyond the factories it destroyed. Strategically, it shattered the Luftwaffe's ability to mount large-scale opposition in the months that followed. The German Air Force had been forced into a war of attrition it could not win. With experienced pilots gone, replacements dying quickly, and production crippled, the Luftwaffe entered a spiral of decline. For the Allies, the skies grew safer with each passing week. When D-Day arrived in June 1944, German fighters were unable to mount serious resistance against the vast Allied armada crossing the Channel. This was no accident. It was the direct result of Big Week and the relentless Mustang escorts that bled the Luftwaffe dry. The campaign proved the decisive power of air superiority in modern war. Control of the skies was not a luxury. It was the foundation for victory on the ground. Big Week had demonstrated this truth with fire and sacrifice, and its consequences would shape the rest of the war. Big Week was more than an operation. It was a turning point. It marked the moment when the Luftwaffe, once invincible, was broken as a strategic force. It marked the moment when daylight bombing became not only possible, but decisive. And it marked the moment when the Mustang fulfilled its destiny as the fighter that crushed the Luftwaffe. Historians often describe Big Week as the death knell of Germany's air power, the campaign that ensured Allied dominance in the skies. For the men who flew it, it was a week of terror, courage, and sacrifice, a crucible from which victory emerged. For the Mustang, it was the ultimate proof of concept, a machine designed in desperation, perfected in collaboration, and proven in battle. From Big Week onward, the Allies owned the skies of Europe. The path to D-Day was cleared, and the Mustang had written its name in history with contrails and cannon fire. The Mustang was more than a machine of steel and rivets. It was a stage upon which human courage and skill were tested daily. Its reputation was built not only on performance charts or production numbers, but on the men who climbed into its cockpit, strapped themselves to its Merlin heart, and met the enemy head-on. These pilots came from farms, cities, and small towns across America, ordinary men who became extraordinary in the skies over Europe. Among them were names that would echo through aviation history: George Preddy, John C. Meyer, Bud Anderson, Don Blakesley, and many others. Each represented a blend of daring, instinct, and relentless determination. They carried the hopes of bomber crews depending on them, and the burden of facing Luftwaffe veterans who had been fighting since 1939. To fly a Mustang was to carry responsibility measured not only in personal survival, but in the success of entire missions. For these aces, every sortie was a duel of skill and fate, and their stories became the living legend of the Mustang. George Preddy, known simply as Preddy to his comrades, was one of the most celebrated Mustang aces of the war. A North Carolinian with a quiet confidence, he was described by fellow pilots as calm, modest, and intensely focused in the air. Flying with the 352nd Fighter Group, the famous blue-nosed bastards of Bodney, Preddy quickly distinguished himself in combat. His ability to read the sky, anticipate enemy movements, and strike with precision made him a natural predator. In July 1944, during a single day's combat, he shot down 6 German aircraft, one of the highest single-day tallies by any US fighter pilot. Preddy's technique was aggressive yet calculated. He never wasted ammunition, firing only when he was certain of a hit. His reputation grew among friend and foe alike as a hunter who always seemed to be in the right place at the right time. Tragically, Preddy was killed on Christmas Day, 1944, accidentally shot down by American anti-aircraft fire during the Battle of the Bulge. By then he had amassed 26.83 confirmed victories, making him the top Mustang ace of the war. His name became forever tied to the legend of the Mustang. John C. Meyer was another towering figure among Mustang aces, known for his leadership as much as his flying skill. Serving with the 352nd Fighter Group, Meyer combined tactical brilliance with raw combat instinct. He often led his men into battle personally, inspiring confidence through his courage and calm under fire. Meyer's most famous exploit came on January 1st, 1945, during Operation Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe's desperate attempt to destroy Allied airfields. That morning, Meyer scrambled in his Mustang and immediately engaged enemy aircraft swarming over Asch, Belgium. In just minutes he shot down 3 German fighters, breaking the attack and saving the airfield from destruction. His coolness under pressure and ability to think quickly in chaos became hallmarks of his career. By war's end, Meyer had achieved 24 confirmed kills, cementing his place among America's greatest fighter leaders. After the war he continued his service, eventually rising to the rank of 4-star general and Commander-in-Chief of Strategic Air Command. Meyer's career embodied the Mustang's story, from desperate battles in the skies over Europe to lasting influence on the future of American air power. Todd Anderson, known as Old Crow, represented another face of Mustang mastery. Flying with the 357th Fighter Group, Anderson developed a reputation for precision, patience, and consistency. He was not a flamboyant pilot, nor one who sought glory, but his discipline made him one of the most effective Mustang aces of the war. Anderson flew more than 100 missions without ever being hit or forced to bail out, a remarkable record in the deadly skies of Europe. His Mustang, always christened Old Crow, became as iconic as the pilot himself. Anderson's 16 confirmed victories included duels with some of Germany's best, and he often credited teamwork and discipline rather than individual skill for his success. His philosophy was simple: fly smart, fly steady, and trust the machine beneath you. After the war, Anderson remained in aviation, serving in both Korea and Vietnam, his career spanning decades. For those who knew him, he embodied the Mustang pilot's ideal, not reckless bravado, but steady excellence. His story proved that the Mustang was as much a tool for disciplined professionals as for daring lone wolves. Don Blakesley was cut from a different cloth. A fiery, aggressive leader who demanded the best from his men and led by example. Commanding the 4th Fighter Group, Blakesley was already a veteran of combat with the RAF's Eagle squadrons before America entered the war. He brought that experience and his fiery personality into the Mustang era. Known for his boldness, Blakesley once ordered his men into combat just hours after receiving their new P-51 SAS, without waiting for proper familiarization. He believed in overwhelming aggression, striking the enemy hard and fast, and never letting up. His leadership turned the 4th into one of the most lethal groups in the European theater. Blakesley himself claimed 15.5 aerial victories, but his true impact was measured in the performance of the men he commanded. Under his leadership, the group destroyed over 1,000 enemy aircraft. His Mustang, Squaw Thair, became a symbol of his relentless spirit. For Blakesley, the Mustang was not just a fighter, it was a weapon to be wielded with fury. His philosophy echoed in the skies every time his men tore into the Luftwaffe. The stories of these aces highlight the Mustang's dual nature as both machine and partner. Each pilot brought his own style to the cockpit, and the Mustang adapted to them all. For Preddy, it was a scalpel, precise and deadly in careful hands. For Meyer, it was a sword of leadership, rallying his men to victory. For Anderson, it was a steady companion, reliable and enduring through mission after mission. For Blakesley, it was a hammer, a blunt force weapon to break the enemy's will. This adaptability was part of what made the Mustang legendary. It could be as patient or as aggressive as its pilot demanded. Beyond statistics and kill counts, the stories reveal the bond between man and machine, forged in fire and fear at 25,000 feet. Pilots spoke of the Mustang almost as a living thing, a partner that shared their risks and victories. These relationships gave the Mustang its soul. Without them, it would have been just another airplane. With them, it became a legend. Behind every ace was a story of duels fought in the skies, moments of life and death decided in seconds. Priddy's 6 kills in one day were not the result of luck, but of positioning, instinct, and the Mustang's raw performance. Meyer's defense of Ash was a testament to preparation, aggression, and the Mustang's ability to respond instantly. Anderson's survival across 100 missions showed how discipline and trust in the aircraft could carry a man through countless battles. Blakesley's relentless raids demonstrated the Mustang's endurance, its ability to go where other fighters could not, and stay longer than the Luftwaffe could endure. These stories are not just about victories, they are about the survival of a doctrine, the protection of bombers, and the steady strangling of Germany's air force. Each ace added to the Mustang's growing reputation, inspiring new pilots and demoralizing the enemy. Their exploits filled headlines, propaganda reels, and letters home, turning them into household names. In every duel the Mustang was proving itself, and through these aces, its legend was etched deeper into history. By the end of the war, Mustang aces had written a chapter of aviation history that would resonate for generations. They had taken a machine born of desperation, refined by collaboration, and forged it into the spearhead of Allied air power. Their stories were not just about kills, but about the endurance of missions, the salvation of bomber crews, and the relentless erosion of the Luftwaffe. The Mustang became their canvas, and in the fire of battle, they painted masterpieces of courage and skill. George Priddy's brilliance, John C. Meyer's leadership, Bud Anderson's steadiness, Don Blakesley's ferocity, all became part of the Mustang's mythology. Thousands of others, less famous, but no less courageous, added their part to the story. Together they made the Mustang not only the finest fighter of World War II, but a symbol of what courage, technology, and determination could achieve. The aces gave the Mustang its human face, and in doing so, they ensured its legend would live far beyond the war. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history began along the beaches of Normandy. While soldiers stormed ashore, the outcome of the operation depended as much on the skies above as the sands below. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, had been weakened by months of attrition during Big Week and the relentless Mustang-led escort campaigns. Yet the threat was still real. A single German raid could devastate landing craft, strafe beaches, or cut off Allied reinforcements. Into this moment of destiny flew the P-51 Mustang, tasked with ensuring that the skies over Normandy belonged to the Allies. Mustangs roared over the channel in endless patrols, circling above invasion fleets, scouting ahead, and hunting for any sign of German aircraft. The sleek fighters had become both shield and sword, protecting the fragile lifeline between Britain and France. For the men below, their thunder was reassurance. For the Germans, it was a sound of doom. The invasion would not be contested in the air, not while the Mustang stood guard. The Mustang's role on D-Day was multifaceted, reflecting its versatility as a fighter. Long-range patrols swept deep inland, ensuring that German reinforcements moving toward the beaches were harassed and slowed. At lower altitudes, Mustangs prowled roads and rail lines, machine guns blazing into convoys and locomotives. Bridges were bombed, rail cars shattered, and communications severed. The Mustang became a terror to German supply lines, striking with speed and precision before climbing away to safety. Pilots were instructed to strafe anything that moved on French roads, trucks, cars, even horse-drawn wagons, because every vehicle might carry troops or ammunition to the front. This ruthless interdiction slowed German responses and gave Allied troops on the beaches time to establish a foothold. At the same time, high-altitude patrols scanned the skies, ensuring no Luftwaffe formations could reach the landing zones. The result was near-total air supremacy. The Germans, once capable of sending waves of fighters into battle, managed only scattered appearances. For the Allies, this absence was proof of the Mustang's triumph. The Luftwaffe had been broken before D-Day ever began. The few German aircraft that did appear over Normandy faced overwhelming opposition. A handful of FLU 190C and Bef 109S attempted to dive on the invasion fleet, but they were met by Mustangs, Spitfires, and Thunderbolts in coordinated sweeps. The result was one-sided slaughter. American and British fighters outnumbered and outperformed the Germans, cutting them down before they could inflict serious damage. Luftwaffe records from June 6 reveal a grim tally: only a fraction of the German Air Force in France managed to take to the skies, and most of those never returned. Mustang squadrons claimed kills across the invasion corridor, chasing German fighters into their own airfields and strafing them even as they tried to land. It was an air war reduced to desperation, with Germany's once mighty fighter arm now scattered and bloodied. Allied commanders later noted that air supremacy was so overwhelming that ground troops scarcely noticed the Luftwaffe's presence. The Mustang had ensured this outcome. By dominating the skies, it had made the landings possible. Without control of the air, D-Day might have failed. With it, success became inevitable. In the days after the landings, the Mustang's mission expanded beyond simple escort and interception. It became a key instrument of tactical support, striking targets across Normandy to isolate the battlefield. Squadrons were assigned to hunt rail yards, ammunition dumps, and troop concentrations, crippling Germany's ability to reinforce its frontline defenders. Mustang pilots flew low and fast, braving anti-aircraft fire from concealed positions in hedgerows and villages. Strafing runs ripped through columns of trucks, scattering survivors into ditches and fields. Bombing sorties struck bridges and crossroads, turning vital supply arteries into flaming wreckage. German soldiers began to dread the distant growl of Merlin engines, for it meant death from above was seconds away. In this role, the Mustang became not only a strategic weapon but a tactical one, shaping the outcome of battles on the ground. Infantry commanders praised its effectiveness, knowing that every destroyed convoy was one less counterattack to face. The Mustang had evolved once again, proving itself as indispensable to the ground war as to the air war. Its versatility was unmatched. For Mustang pilots, the Normandy campaign was a mix of exhilaration and danger. Strafing missions at treetop level demanded nerves of steel, as every farmhouse and hedgerow could conceal machine guns or flak cannons. Many aircraft returned riddled with holes, their fuselages scarred by enemy fire, but the Mustang's ruggedness often brought pilots home alive. The danger was constant, yet so was the sense of purpose. Pilots knew that their actions directly shaped the progress of the invasion, that each destroyed convoy bought time for soldiers struggling through hedgerows and villages. For bomber escort missions, the Mustang's dominance at altitude meant fewer losses, and morale among bomber crews soared. Letters from infantrymen described their gratitude for the angels overhead, whose strafing runs often broke up counterattacks before they reached Allied lines. For the Germans, these same aircraft were phantoms of terror, descending without warning, unleashing destruction and vanishing before retaliation could come. To fly a Mustang over Normandy was to live at the razor's edge, but also to write history with every mission. It was the fighter's finest hour. As the Allies pushed inland, the Mustang extended its reach across France. Airfields were quickly constructed in Normandy, allowing Mustangs to operate directly from the continent rather than flying long legs across the Channel. This increased their presence, with patrols now able to range deeper into occupied territory and maintain constant pressure on retreating German forces. The Luftwaffe attempted sporadic counterattacks, but fuel shortages and relentless Allied raids kept most German squadrons grounded. By July 1944, Mustang sweeps ensured that German reinforcements moving toward Normandy faced relentless harassment. Trains were derailed, bridges demolished, and columns of armor set ablaze. The Mustang had become the hammer of interdiction, cutting off German defenders from supply and reinforcement. The collapse of German mobility was as much a product of air power as of ground combat. And in this campaign of isolation, the Mustang was indispensable. It was not simply escorting anymore. It was dictating the tempo of the war. The enemy could not move without risking annihilation. The Mustang's performance during and after D-Day also reshaped Allied doctrine. Air commanders realized that the fighter was not only a guardian for bombers, but a versatile platform for tactical dominance. Missions were increasingly planned around its capabilities: deep escort one day, ground attack the next, fighter sweeps the day after. Its range meant it could adapt to shifting fronts, while its speed and agility allowed it to fight any aircraft the enemy could muster. This adaptability gave Allied planners a level of flexibility the Luftwaffe could no longer match. D-Day had proven that air superiority was not a luxury, but the foundation of modern warfare. The beaches had been won in no small part because the skies were uncontested, and those skies belonged to the Mustang. Its contribution could not be measured in sorties or bomb tonnage alone. It was measured in the survival of soldiers, the success of the invasion, and the collapse of German resistance. The Mustang had redefined what a fighter could do. It was no longer just a plane. It was the embodiment of Allied air power. By the summer of 1944, the Mustang had secured its place not only as a guardian of bombers, but as a decisive actor in the liberation of Europe. Its role in Normandy proved that air superiority was the ultimate multiplier of force, enabling ground armies to fight and win under its protection. German commanders admitted after the war that their movements were paralyzed, their supply lines shattered, and their troops demoralized by constant Allied fighter-bomber attacks. The Mustang had done more than escort. It had suffocated the enemy's ability to resist. As Allied armies broke out of Normandy and surged across France, Mustangs continued to lead the way, ensuring that the Luftwaffe could not regroup. For the men on the ground, their presence was a lifeline. For the enemy, it was a sentence of inevitable defeat. The Normandy campaign had been the greatest test of Allied power, and the Mustang had proven itself the master of the skies. From D-Day onward, its legend was unassailable. It was not just a fighter, it was the sword of liberation. The P-51 Mustang's true revolution lay not only in its speed or firepower, but in its ability to go the distance. Before its arrival, the US 8th Air Force struggled with a problem that seemed unsolvable. Bombers could fly deep into Germany, but their escorts could not. Spitfires lacked endurance. Thunderbolts ran out of fuel before Berlin, and even the twin-engined Lightning was stretched thin. Once the escorts turned back, bomber formations were left exposed, and the Luftwaffe descended upon them with ruthless efficiency. Raids on Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Bremen became bloodbaths, with dozens of bombers lost in single missions. Morale among crews plummeted, and commanders questioned whether daylight bombing could continue at all. Then came the Mustang, its laminar flow wing and fuel-efficient design, promising something entirely new. With external drop tanks mounted beneath its wings, the Mustang could stretch its legs across Europe, fly to Berlin, Leipzig, or Munich, and still return. For the first time, the idea of true long-range escort was not theory, it was reality, and it would change everything. The drop tank was deceptively simple, a streamlined container of fuel slung under each wing, feeding the Mustang's hungry Merlin engine during the long flight in and out of German airspace. Once empty, the tanks could be jettisoned with a flick of a switch, freeing the aircraft for combat. This gave the Mustang unmatched flexibility. It could cruise economically on external fuel, then fight at full performance on internal reserves. Earlier fighters had experimented with drop tanks, but only the Mustang combined the aerodynamic efficiency and fuel management to make them truly decisive. With twin 75-gallon or 108-gallon tanks, the Mustang could extend its range by hundreds of miles. Missions that once stretched the limits of Allied fighters were now routine. Bomber crews who had once dreaded the moment their escorts turned back now looked out their windows to see Mustangs still there, mile after mile, hour after hour. This endurance transformed not only strategy, but morale. The Mustang's long legs gave daylight bombing the shield it had always lacked, and that shield was unbreakable. The strategic implications of this range advantage were profound. With Mustangs at their side, American bombers could finally strike deep into the heart of the Reich. Targets that had once been too dangerous, aircraft factories in Leipzig, oil refineries in Merseburg, rail yards in Munich, were now within reach. The Luftwaffe, forced to rise and defend, found itself facing Mustangs not only near the borders, but over its very homeland. No longer could German fighters wait for escorts to peel away before launching mass attacks. Instead, they had to fight their way through swarms of Mustangs, often before reaching the bomber streams. This shift gutted German air defenses, draining their strength over weeks and months. With their long legs, Mustangs did not just escort, they hunted, ranging far ahead to clear the skies before bombers arrived. What had once been a gamble of attrition became a calculated campaign of destruction. Range had turned precision bombing into a war-winning instrument, and the Mustang was the key. Pilots quickly adapted to the new opportunities long-range endurance provided. Escort formations no longer clung tightly to the bombers, as they had with shorter-legged fighters. Instead, Mustangs pushed out into aggressive sweeps, patrolling enemy airspace like predators. They struck German fighters as they climbed from their airfields, ambushed them at assembly points, and pursued them far from the bomber streams. This aggressive doctrine, made possible by range, turned the Mustang from a passive escort into an offensive weapon. For German pilots, the skies became hostile even before they reached the battle. For American pilots, it meant freedom. The freedom to fight on their own terms, to dictate where and when combat happened. Many Mustangs returned to base with empty gun belts, but full fuel tanks, having spent their missions hunting instead of merely protecting. This was the evolution of escort into domination, and it was the Mustang's range that made it possible. The psychological effect of this range advantage was immense. For bomber crews, it meant hope, survival, and confidence. No longer did they watch their escorts peel away at the German border, bracing for the inevitable swarms of interceptors. Instead, they saw Mustangs above, below, and alongside them, all the way to the target. The little friends, as crews affectionately called them, became symbols of safety. For the Luftwaffe, it was the opposite. They could no longer choose their moment, no longer rely on bomber streams being undefended. Every raid now came with a gauntlet of Mustangs, and every sortie risked death before they even reached the bombers. The psychological toll was crushing, sapping morale among German pilots who once believed themselves invincible. The long legs of the Mustang stretched not only across geography, but across the minds of men. They carried not only fuel, but fear. The extended range also redefined Allied strategy at the operational level, with Mustangs to cover them. Bombers could be assigned to targets once deemed too distant or risky. The systematic destruction of German oil refineries, synthetic fuel plants, and transportation networks became possible. Rail lines in Austria, factories in Czechoslovakia, and even targets near the borders of Poland fell within reach. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin, was forced to defend everywhere at once, a task it could not sustain. This strain was not only physical but logistical. Fuel, pilots, and aircraft were drained across multiple fronts, leaving gaps the Allies exploited ruthlessly. The Mustang's long legs had turned Europe into a battlefield with no sanctuary. There was nowhere to hide, no safe zone beyond Allied reach. For Germany, this was the beginning of the end. For the Allies, it was the opening of the road to victory. The Mustang's range advantage was not without its challenges. Long missions of 6 to 8 hours tested both pilots and machines. Fatigue set in as men sat cramped in cockpits, braving cold temperatures, monotony, and constant alertness. Navigation over hostile territory required precision, and a single mistake could mean running out of fuel before reaching safety. Drop tanks themselves were vulnerable to enemy fire and could be jettisoned prematurely in combat, reducing endurance. Yet despite these risks, the Mustang delivered results. Its efficiency, ruggedness, and adaptability allowed it to endure the strain of long missions. Pilots learned to manage fuel carefully, to balance aggression with conservation, and to bring their machines home from the edge of exhaustion. These were not easy flights, but they were decisive ones. Each long mission stretched the Mustang's legend further. Each mile flown was another step toward Germany's defeat. In the end, the Mustang's range was not just a technical achievement, it was a strategic revolution. It bridged the gap between doctrine and reality, turning daylight precision bombing from a dream into a decisive weapon. It gave bombers the shield they needed, gave fighter pilots the freedom to hunt, and gave commanders the tool to strangle Germany's war machine at its heart. The Luftwaffe could not match it, could not outlast it, and could not hide from it. The long legs of the Mustang carried not only fuel, but destiny, carrying the war from Britain's shores to Berlin's factories, from the Channel to the Alps. It was the edge that broke Germany's resistance, the advantage that ensured Allied dominance. Without it, daylight bombing might have failed. With it, victory became inevitable. The Mustang's long legs were not just range, they were reach, and that reach stretched all the way to the end of the war. By 1944 and 1945, the skies over Germany had become a vast battleground where the Luftwaffe fought desperately to stave off defeat. The once proud German air arm was reduced to defending its own cities and factories, flying against relentless waves of Allied bombers and their Mustang escorts. For the pilots of the P-51, missions now took them deep into the Reich, over Berlin, Leipzig, Munich, and even to the borders of Czechoslovakia. These flights were long, exhausting, and fraught with danger, but they carried the weight of strategic destruction. Each sortie meant duels with German fighters clawing to protect their homeland, aces fighting on instinct, and rookies sent into the sky with barely a dozen hours of training. The Mustang pilots faced enemies who had nothing left to lose, and battles became more desperate as Germany's situation grew dire. Bombers were still prime targets, but by 1944, Mustangs had shifted to aggressive sweeps designed to hunt the Luftwaffe itself. The skies over the Reich were no longer Germany's shield, they had become the Mustangs' hunting ground, and in those hunts, history was written one dogfight at a time. The Mustang's most iconic duels came not against the familiar Bf 109S or FW190S, but against a new threat, the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet fighter. Introduced in 1944, the Me 262 was the world's first operational jet, capable of speeds over 540 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles faster than the Mustang. In straight-line performance, no piston fighter could match it. German propaganda hailed it as the miracle weapon that would turn the tide of the war. Yet the Mustang pilots quickly discovered its weaknesses. The Me 262's jet engines were fragile, slow to accelerate, and vulnerable during takeoff and landing. Mustangs patrolled near airfields, waiting to pounce on the jets as they rose sluggishly into the air or returned low on fuel. These ambushes were brutal, with Mustangs destroying jets before they reached full speed. Once airborne and at combat speed, the Me 262 was nearly untouchable, but the Mustang denied it the freedom to fight on its own terms. Technology had given Germany an edge, but tactics and numbers erased it. The Mustang had outsmarted the jet age. Dogfights over the Reich in 1944 and 1945 were unlike anything earlier in the war. The Luftwaffe no longer had the numbers to swarm Allied formations, but those who flew fought with ferocity. Bf 109 Seekers dove head-on into bomber streams, cannons blazing, hoping to break formations with a single strike. Bf 190S attacked from the sides, unleashing devastating bursts before banking away in hit-and-run tactics. The Mustangs, however, were always there. They intercepted attacks before they reached the bombers, turning German assaults into chaotic melees of fire and smoke. Pilots engaged in twisting duels among contrails, chasing each other through flak-filled skies, where a mistake meant instant death. The Germans fought with desperation, but the Mustangs fought with confidence, knowing they had the speed, range, and numbers to prevail. Each engagement chipped away at the Luftwaffe's dwindling strength. Dogfights over Berlin, over the Ruhr, over the Danube were not merely clashes of machines, they were the last stand of an air force gasping for survival. Berlin itself became a symbolic battlefield for the Mustang. By 1944, American bombers were striking the German capital regularly, escorted by swarms of P-51 Sow. For German civilians, the sight of contrails above the city became a grim reminder of their vulnerability. For German pilots, Berlin represented both duty and desperation. They had to defend the heart of the Reich, no matter the cost. Mustangs hunted relentlessly over the capital, diving into German formations, chasing stragglers into the suburbs, and strafing airfields around the city. The Luftwaffe attempted massed counterattacks, but they no longer had the numbers to sustain them. Mustang groups like the 4th, 352nd, and 357th Fighter Groups gained reputations as ruthless hunters, claiming dozens of victories in single missions. For bomber crews, the protection was life-saving. For German defenders, it was agony. The battle for Berlin's skies was the culmination of years of attrition, a struggle fought not only with machines but with will, and in that struggle, the Mustang stood triumphant. The Luftwaffe adapted with new tactics, hoping to claw back an edge. Some German fighters were armed with rockets, designed to smash through bomber formations with explosive salvos, Others mounted heavier cannons to bring down B-17 Siphoned and B-24s in single bursts, but these modifications often made the aircraft slower and less maneuverable, easy prey for the Mustangs. German pilots tried surprise attacks, climbing high above formations before diving at blistering speeds. Yet the Mustangs, loitering at higher altitudes, often intercepted them before they struck. The Luftwaffe also began using inexperienced pilots in greater numbers, throwing young men barely out of flight school into combat against seasoned Mustang squadrons. The results were catastrophic. Mustang pilots described the heartbreaking sight of shooting down opponents who lacked the skill to fight back. Each new tactic only deepened the Luftwaffe's losses. The Mustangs adapted quickly, countering every move. The Germans were fighting with ingenuity and bravery, but it was no longer enough. The Mustang's superiority was not only technical, but also strategic. By 1945, the Allies had complete air dominance, with Mustangs roaming freely across Germany. Fighter sweeps no longer just escorted bombers. They hunted German aircraft wherever they could be found. Strafing runs devastated airfields, with Mustangs destroying aircraft on the ground by the hundreds. Fuel depots, supply convoys, and railway junctions were blasted, leaving the Luftwaffe crippled before it could even rise to fight. In many cases, German pilots took off only to be shot down within minutes. Their airfields surrounded by circling Mustangs. The P-51 had become not just a fighter but a weapon of strategic strangulation, cutting off Germany's last veins of resistance. By relentlessly targeting infrastructure, the Mustangs ensured that even if aircraft were produced, they could not fly effectively. This was air war at its most complete, not only domination in the air, but the systematic dismantling of the enemy's ability to resist at all. For Mustang pilots, these late war missions were both triumphant and harrowing. They knew they were fighting a defeated enemy, but also one still capable of deadly surprises. Me-262 jets, flak batteries, and desperate German pilots ensured that danger was never absent. Long hours in the cockpit tested endurance, while dogfights over enemy territory carried the constant risk of capture or death. Yet there was also exhilaration, the sense of being part of something decisive, of flying the best machine of the war at the very moment victory was within reach. Pilots spoke of the surreal beauty of dogfights above Berlin, contrails stretching across a blue sky, sunlight flashing on wings as fighters spun and twisted. They also spoke of loss, friends who never returned, aircraft that vanished into smoke. Victory was coming, but it was paid for in blood. The Mustang had given them the tools. It was up to the men to wield them, and they did so with relentless determination. By the spring of 1945, the Luftwaffe's resistance was broken. The Bf-109S and F-190S that once dominated the skies were scattered remnants, their numbers reduced to a trickle. The Me-262 jets, for all their promise, could not alter the course of the war. The Mustang had proven its superiority not only against propeller-driven opponents, but against the dawn of the jet age. Over Berlin, over Dresden, over the crumbling cities of the Reich, Mustangs flew with impunity, the masters of skies once owned by Germany. They had hunted the Luftwaffe to exhaustion, bled it dry, and denied it any chance of recovery. Dogfights over the Reich were no longer balanced duels. They were the final acts of a struggle already decided. The Mustang had carried the war to Germany's doorstep and beyond, its long legs and lethal claws ensuring total dominance. In the end, it was not a single dogfight that defined the Mustang's triumph. It was the sum of thousands. Together they broke the Luftwaffe's back, and with it the Reich itself. The story of the Mustang cannot be told without honoring the men of the 332nd Fighter Group, better known as the Tuskegee Airmen. At a time when America was still deeply segregated, these African American pilots trained at Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama, overcoming prejudice, doubt, and systemic barriers to earn their wings. Many in the military establishment doubted their abilities, assuming wrongly that black pilots lacked the skill or discipline to succeed in combat. The Tuskegee program itself was born as an experiment, designed more to prove failure than success. But what emerged was one of the most elite fighter groups of the war. Their aircraft bore a distinct mark, bright red painted tails that became their signature. Soon bomber crews began calling them the Red Tails, a nickname that would live forever in aviation history. For these pilots, flying Mustangs was not only a chance to serve their country, but to prove their worth in a world that doubted them. Their story became one of courage, excellence, and legacy, written in the skies of Europe. The 332nd Fighter Group was composed of 4 squadrons: the 99th, 100th, 301st, and 302nd Fighter Squadrons. Initially flying P-40 Warhawks and later P-47 Thunderbolts, the group transitioned to the P-51 Mustang in 1944. The arrival of the Mustang transformed their capabilities, giving them the speed, altitude performance, and range to escort bombers into the deepest parts of Germany. With their red-painted tails, they quickly became recognizable in the skies, both to bomber crews who welcomed their protection and to German pilots who feared their precision. The Tuskegee Airmen earned a reputation for discipline in their escort duties, staying close to bomber formations even when the temptation arose to chase kills. This discipline earned the trust of the bomber crews, who often wrote letters praising the Red Tails for never abandoning them. The men of the 332nd took immense pride in this reputation. They were not just fighting the Luftwaffe, they were fighting prejudice, proving themselves with every mission. In the cockpit of a Mustang, they found both a weapon and a voice. Combat reports soon confirmed what bomber crews already knew. The Red Tails were exceptional. The 332nd escorted hundreds of bomber missions, protecting B-17 Sedia and B-24 SES as they penetrated deep into enemy territory. In March 1945, on a mission to Berlin, they famously engaged Me-262 jet fighters, shooting down several despite the technological disadvantage of piston engines against jets. Their kill-to-loss ratio steadily grew, demonstrating not only skill, but tactical awareness. While early myths suggested they never lost a bomber under their protection, a claim later revised, they still maintained one of the lowest loss rates of any escort group in the 8th or 15th Air Forces. For the bomber crews, the sight of those red tails meant safety, precision, and a steady hand in chaos. The Germans quickly learned to respect the discipline and ferocity of the Red Tails. For the men of the 332nd, every victory was more than a kill, it was proof against prejudice. Each enemy aircraft destroyed was also a strike against doubt. Among the Tuskegee Airmen were individual heroes whose names deserve remembrance. Lee Archer, one of the group's most famous aces, achieved at least 5 aerial victories, including a remarkable day in July 1944, when he downed 3 enemy fighters in a single mission. Charles McGee flew more than 100 missions in World War II, and went on to serve in Korea and Vietnam, ultimately flying over 400 combat missions in his career. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., commander of the 332nd, became the guiding force behind their discipline and success. A graduate of West Point, Davis endured years of isolation and discrimination, but his leadership inspired his men to rise above prejudice. Under his command, the Red Tails became one of the most respected fighter groups in the war. These men were not only warriors, they were pioneers. They carried the weight of history on their shoulders and bore it with courage. In every Mustang they flew, they wrote a story larger than themselves, a story of service and dignity that transcended the battlefield. The Mustang itself seemed the perfect match for the Tuskegee Airmen's mission. Its long range allowed them to accompany bombers on the longest missions, including raids to Berlin, Munich, and beyond. Its speed and agility allowed them to fight German fighters on equal or superior terms. The Red Tails quickly developed tactics that emphasized teamwork, discipline, and coordinated strikes. While some fighter groups prioritized chasing down German fighters for high kill counts, the 332nd remained committed to its primary mission, keeping the bombers safe. This sense of responsibility became their hallmark. Bomber crews began requesting the Red Tails by name, writing in their mission reports that they felt safest when protected by the 332nd. For pilots who had once faced discrimination in their own country, this trust was deeply meaningful. The Mustang gave them the platform, but it was their discipline that made them legendary. Together, man and machine became a bond that altered history. The Red Tails' successes were not achieved without cost. Missions into Germany were dangerous for all fighter groups, and the 332nd faced heavy losses from flak, accidents, and combat. Many young pilots never returned, their Mustangs falling in flames over enemy territory. Yet their sacrifice carried a double burden. They knew they were not only dying for their country, but also fighting for recognition in a society that still segregated them. Letters home revealed the pain of this dual reality, pride in their service but frustration at the discrimination they endured even in uniform. Despite this, they pressed forward, bound by duty and camaraderie. Each mission was a statement that courage knows no color, that excellence transcends prejudice. Their losses were mourned deeply within their community, but their achievements carried the promise of change. They were breaking barriers one sortie at a time, and the Mustang was their instrument of defiance. By the end of the war, the Tuskegee Airmen had compiled an extraordinary record. They flew over 15,000 sorties, destroyed or damaged more than 250 enemy aircraft in the air and on the ground, and earned hundreds of distinguished flying crosses, air medals, and unit citations. The 332nd became one of the most decorated groups in the U.S. Army Air Forces. Their red tails were recognized by friend and foe alike as a symbol of discipline and deadly efficiency. More importantly, their success shattered stereotypes, proving once and for all that African American pilots could not only serve but excel at the highest levels of combat aviation. Their record became a rallying point for the broader fight for civil rights, inspiring future generations to demand equality. In the years after the war, many Tuskegee veterans went on to become leaders in the military and in civilian life, shaping the future of America itself. Their Mustangs had carried them into combat. Their courage had carried them into history. The legacy of the Red Tails endures as one of the most powerful stories of World War II. Their Mustang fighters, gleaming with red-painted tails, remain icons of both aviation and social progress. They proved that skill, courage, and determination were blind to race, and in doing so they struck a blow against the walls of prejudice. The Mustang gave them the tool, but it was their will that made it legendary. Today, their story is celebrated in museums, films, and memorials, a reminder of how far they flew not only in miles but in history. They changed the perception of African Americans in the military and laid groundwork for integration in the armed forces. In the skies over Europe, they fought two wars at once, one against the Luftwaffe, the other against discrimination. In both, they emerged victorious. The red tails of their Mustangs did not just mark their aircraft. They marked a turning point. They became the color of courage, the color of progress, and the color of legacy. When people think of the Mustang, they often picture Europe, bomber escorts over Germany, and duels with the Luftwaffe. Yet the P-51 also played a critical role in the Pacific, where the war unfolded across vast oceans, scattered islands, and a very different enemy. The Pacific Air War was defined not by dense skies of contrails and flak, but by long, grueling flights over endless water, followed by brutal combat over Japanese territory. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan presented challenges unlike anything in Europe. B-29 superfortresses, with their massive range, could strike Japan from newly captured islands, but they needed protection against Japanese fighters. Here the Mustang once again became indispensable. Its long legs made it the only Allied fighter capable of escorting B-29 Sai from Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back, a mission over 1,500 miles round trip. These flights were some of the longest single-seat combat missions of the war. For the pilots, they were journeys into isolation, danger, and history. The capture of Iwo Jima in early 1945 was not only about securing a base for bombers, but also about giving fighters a platform close enough to escort them from the volcanic island's rough airstrips. Mustangs of the 7th Fighter Command began launching missions to Japan. The distance was immense, over 650 miles to Tokyo alone. Pilots spent hours in their cockpits before even reaching enemy airspace, conserving fuel carefully to ensure they had enough for combat and the return journey. Drop tanks were essential, extending their range but adding weight and vulnerability until they could be jettisoned. Once over Japan, the missions transformed from monotonous cruising to sudden chaos as Japanese fighters rose to intercept the bombers. Pilots had to remain sharp after hours of silence, ready to spring into violent dogfights at a moment's notice. These missions were grueling tests of endurance as much as skill, but the Mustang proved equal to the challenge. From Iwo Jima, it became the long arm of American air power, reaching Japan's skies directly. The Japanese fighter threat was formidable, even late in the war. Aircraft like the Mitsubishi A6M0, though increasingly outdated by 1945, remained agile and dangerous in skilled hands. Other planes, such as the Ki-84, Frank and Ki-61 Tony, offered more modern competition, capable of challenging Allied fighters in speed and maneuverability. Japanese pilots often attacked B-29 sets with suicidal ferocity, willing to sacrifice their lives to bring down the massive bombers. Against this backdrop, the Mustang's speed, firepower, and high-altitude performance gave it the edge. Pilots learned to use energy tactics, diving from altitude to slash through Japanese formations before climbing back for another strike. Unlike in Europe, where the Luftwaffe was crumbling, Japanese airmen still fought with tenacity, and many Mustang pilots described them as fearless opponents. Yet the red tails of Europe had proven discipline mattered more than desperation, and the same truth applied here. The Mustang's combination of endurance, firepower, and resilience steadily wore down Japanese resistance. Each mission eroded Japan's already overstretched air force. The longest and most critical missions were the escorts of B-29s to Tokyo, the very heart of Imperial Japan. These missions began at dawn, with Mustangs lifting off from Iwo Jima in the half-light, climbing slowly into formation as the ocean stretched endlessly beneath them. Hours later they reached the coastline of Japan, escorting the massive bomber formations as they crossed mountains and rivers toward Tokyo. Here the Mustangs faced not only fighters but dense flak and the dangers of urban combat zones. Dogfights swirled above burning cities, contrails streaking the skies as B-29s unleashed destruction below. For the bombers, The presence of Mustangs meant survival. Loss rates dropped dramatically once escorts became regular, and bomber crews developed a deep bond with their fighter protectors. For Mustang pilots, the missions demanded not just combat skill, but mental endurance. 10 hours in the cockpit, facing fatigue, hunger, and the constant possibility of death. These flights became legendary in their own right. The Mustang had proven it could dominate even the vast skies of the Pacific. The Mustang's presence over Japan also enabled fighter sweeps and ground attack missions that crippled Japanese infrastructure. Once bomber formations had been escorted to their targets, Mustangs often peeled away to strafe airfields, attack supply depots, and destroy aircraft on the ground. These missions were devastating, as Japanese airfields became killing grounds under Mustang guns. Pilots described rows of parked aircraft bursting into flames as their .50 caliber rounds tore through them. Locomotives exploded, oil depots burned, and trucks scattered in panic. These attacks not only reduced Japan's ability to resist, but also forced the Japanese to divert resources to air defense at a time when their economy was collapsing. The Mustang's versatility, escort, fighter, and ground attacker proved invaluable in this theater, just as it had in Europe. It was a weapon of relentless pressure, one that struck at Japan from the skies every day. For the enemy, the Mustang became a symbol of inevitability. No matter where they flew, fought, or hid, the red-tailed escorts would be there. One of the defining differences in the Pacific Campaign was the kamikaze threat. Japanese pilots, ordered to ram their planes into ships or bombers, posed a new kind of danger. For Mustang pilots, intercepting kamikaze flights before they reached their targets became an urgent priority. The agility and speed of the P-51 allowed it to intercept attackers in the moments before impact, but the desperation of the kamikaze made them unpredictable foes. Many Mustang pilots recalled the chilling sight of Japanese planes refusing to disengage even as they burned, steering themselves toward targets until the final second. These missions tested not only flying skill but nerve. Shooting down a kamikaze meant saving hundreds of lives on the ground or at sea, yet it was often a race against time. The Mustang became one of the key counters to this grim tactic, hunting down kamikaze flights before they could strike. In doing so, it preserved countless ships and crews. The Pacific had its own horrors, and the Mustang met them head-on. The endurance required for Pacific missions was legendary. Pilots often spent 8 to 10 hours in the cockpit, strapped into a seat with little room to move, enduring fatigue and discomfort while staying alert. Navigation over vast stretches of ocean relied on careful planning, radio guidance, and sheer precision. One mistake could mean fuel exhaustion and a watery grave. The Mustang's rugged design and efficient fuel use made these missions possible, but they remained grueling tests of stamina. Pilots brought chocolate, gum, and water to sustain themselves, fighting not only the enemy but their own bodies. Many described returning from missions physically drained, barely able to stand after climbing from their cockpits. Yet, despite these hardships, they flew again and again, driven by duty and determination. The Mustang, in turn, carried them faithfully across thousands of miles of hostile skies. These long missions added a new layer to the Mustang's legend, proving it was not only a dogfighter, but a long-range warrior. Few fighters in history had ever flown so far, fought so hard, and returned so reliably. By the war's end, the Mustang's role in the Pacific had become just as defining as its triumphs in Europe. From Iwo Jima, Mustangs flew escort, sweep, and strike missions that directly supported the destruction of Japan's air force and infrastructure. They gave B-29 crews the shield they needed to carry out the firebombing campaigns that devastated Japanese cities. They broke the last remnants of Japanese air power and sealed the skies over the Pacific for Allied dominance. For the pilots who flew them, the Pacific missions were among the most difficult and dangerous of the war, but they proved the Mustang's unmatched versatility. When victory finally came in August 1945, the Mustang stood as the only Allied fighter to have truly dominated in both Europe and the Pacific. It had carried its pilots across continents and oceans, over cities and seas, into duels with the Luftwaffe, and into the heart of Imperial Japan. In every theater it had been the weapon of choice, the guardian of bombers, and the hunter of enemies. The Mustang was not just a European legend, it was a global one. When the guns of World War II finally fell silent in 1945, the Mustang did not fade into history overnight. Instead, it transitioned into a new role, flying over the shattered landscapes of Europe and Asia during the early days of occupation. From the skies above ruined Berlin to the smoldering remains of Tokyo, P-51 circled as guardians of a fragile peace. No longer escorting bombers or dueling with Luftwaffe aces, they patrolled airfields, escorted transport flights, and served as visible reminders of Allied dominance. In Germany, Mustang squadrons often escorted dignitaries, transported messages, or simply maintained a presence that reassured civilians and dissuaded lingering resistance. In Japan, their red spinners and long wings cast shadows over a defeated empire, enforcing the new order. These missions lacked the glamour of dogfights, but they were vital to stabilizing a world emerging from chaos. The Mustang had won the skies in war. Now it was keeping the skies in peace. Its legend was still unfolding, even in the quiet after victory. The Mustang also became a key figure in the rapid restructuring of post-war air forces. With vast numbers of aircraft produced during the war, over 15,000 Mustangs in total, the fighter was suddenly available in abundance. Many were shipped to Allied nations as part of reconstruction and defense agreements. Britain, which had first embraced the Mustang years earlier, kept them in service even as jet technology began to rise. Countries like Australia, Canada, and South Africa also integrated them into their air fleets. In Latin America, nations such as Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Guatemala operated Mustangs for years, where they flew patrols, guarded borders, and even saw combat in local conflicts. The Mustang's ruggedness, low cost, and proven performance made it attractive to nations unable to afford the newest jets. For many air forces around the world, the Mustang became the backbone of their fighter strength in the late 1940s and early 1950s. It was no longer just America's fighter, it had become a global icon. Yet even as the Mustang spread across the globe, aviation itself was changing. The dawn of the jet age brought aircraft like the P-80 Shooting Star and the British Meteor, machines that could outpace the Mustang by hundreds of miles per hour. For many, this seemed to signal the end of piston-engine fighters entirely. The Mustang, however, proved stubbornly resilient. Its long range and versatility still gave it value at a time when jets were unproven, costly, and limited in endurance. In the immediate post-war years, Mustangs often flew alongside jets, serving as reliable workhorses while their newer cousins suffered teething problems. Pilots continued to praise the Mustang's handling, visibility, and rugged design, even when jets dazzled with their speed. For a time, airfields around the world saw both propellers and jets parked side by side, marking a unique transition in aviation history. The Mustang stood proudly in this liminal space, an emblem of the past, yet still indispensable in the present. In occupied Europe, the Mustang's mission shifted toward deterrence and observation. Allied commanders worried that tensions with the Soviet Union might erupt into new conflicts, and air power was seen as the first line of defense. Mustang squadrons patrolled borders, watched Soviet troop movements, and maintained readiness in case the uneasy peace dissolved into war. These flights carried none of the glory of combat but were heavy with responsibility. A Mustang flying along the Iron Curtain was both symbol and sentinel, projecting strength at a time when Cold War lines were being drawn. In Germany, airmen who had once fought against the Luftwaffe now watched former adversaries become uneasy neighbors. In Japan, Mustangs remained a common sight as American occupation forces established bases and reorganized Asia under a new balance of power. The aircraft's silhouette was instantly recognizable to millions who had once feared it in battle, now seeing it as a harbinger of order. The Mustang's wings carried both the weight of victory and the burden of vigilance. At home in the United States, the Mustang entered a strange twilight period. The Army Air Forces, soon to become the independent U.S. Air Force in 1947, rapidly transitioned to jets. The P-51, renamed the 51 under the new system, was relegated to the Air National Guard and Reserve units. Thousands of Mustangs were mothballed, parked in neat rows at desert storage facilities, their canopies covered in dust. Yet even in this quiet exile, the Mustang was not forgotten. Many airmen who had flown them in Europe and the Pacific spoke of them with reverence, unwilling to trade the responsive, living feel of the Mustang for the early, often temperamental jets. Aviation magazines, air shows and veterans groups kept the Mustang alive in public memory. The aircraft was already becoming more than a machine. It was becoming a legend of freedom, a flying symbol of victory in the greatest war humanity had ever fought. Though its frontline role was fading, its cultural presence was only growing. For nations around the world, the Mustang's survival into the post-war years had practical advantages. Unlike jets, which required advanced maintenance and expensive infrastructure, the Mustang could operate from rough fields, be repaired with simpler tools, and flown by pilots with less training. This made it the fighter of choice for many countries navigating the uncertain post-war landscape. In conflicts across Latin America, Mustangs strafed rebel positions, supported armies, and patrolled borders. In the Middle East, they became part of the fledgling air forces of Egypt and Israel, where they sometimes even clashed against each other in early Arab-Israeli wars. Each conflict added new layers to the Mustang's history, proving that even in a new era of technology, the old warhorse could still deliver. The Mustang had been designed for Europe, perfected for Germany, and extended to Japan, but its life stretched far beyond those battles. In the hands of smaller nations, it became a post-war warrior. Its legend only deepened with each flight. Despite its persistence, the Mustang's days as a frontline fighter were numbered. Jets were simply too fast, too advanced, and too dominant in the skies to be denied. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the Mustang was gradually withdrawn from active service in the world's major powers. Yet its withdrawal was not a defeat. It had survived the transition, bridged the gap between propeller and jet, and secured its place as the definitive piston-engine fighter of history. Its twilight years carried a quiet dignity as it moved from the cutting edge of war to the steady role of peacekeeper, trainer, and national defender in smaller conflicts. Even as it yielded the skies to jets, its contribution remained irreplaceable. Without the Mustang, the path from victory in World War II to the Cold War air forces would have been far more uncertain. Its wings had carried the Allies to triumph. In peace, they carried the world into the future. The post-war years proved that victory had not diminished the Mustang's spirit. Instead, they revealed its adaptability, resilience, and enduring importance in an age of rapid change. The fighter that had crushed the Luftwaffe and escorted bombers to Tokyo now became a guardian of peace, a global export, and a symbol of American air power. from occupation duty to foreign service, from storage yards to small wars, the Mustang continued to fly when others thought it obsolete. Its survival into the jet age was not an accident. It was proof of its extraordinary design, efficiency, and trustworthiness. The world was moving forward, but the Mustang refused to be left behind. For pilots who climbed into its cockpit after 1945, it carried not only them, but also the echoes of history. Every flight was a reminder of what the Mustang had achieved, and every flight extended its legend. The war was over, but the Mustang's story was far from finished. When war erupted on the Korean Peninsula in June 1950, few expected the Mustang to return to the front lines. Jets like the F-80 Shooting Star and the F-86 Sabre were already the pride of the newly established US Air Force. Yet the realities of war dictated otherwise. Korea's rough terrain, limited infrastructure, and shortage of modern air bases made jet operations difficult in the opening months. The Mustang, by then redesignated the F-51, was rugged, versatile, and capable of operating from short makeshift runways that jets could not yet use. Within weeks, the familiar silhouette of the Mustang was once again over battlefields, not over Europe or Japan this time, but over Busan, Incheon, and the frozen hills of North Korea. For a fighter many had considered obsolete, this was an astonishing comeback. The Mustang had been built to escort bombers. Now, in Korea, it would become a low-level attacker, strafing, bombing, and enduring heavy fire in support of ground troops. Its second war had begun. The Mustang's role in Korea was starkly different from its World War II missions. No longer was it dueling Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs in the stratosphere. Instead, it was called upon for close air support, flying low and fast over rugged terrain, unleashing rockets, bombs, and machine gun fire into enemy positions. These missions were brutal. Pilots navigated through valleys filled with hidden anti-aircraft guns, dodging flak bursts and small arms fire from camouflaged positions. They flew in all weather, often with minimal visibility, targeting columns of tanks, supply depots, bridges, and troop concentrations. The Mustang's 6.50 caliber machine guns, once feared by the Luftwaffe, now ripped into North Korean supply convoys. Its ability to carry rockets and bombs made it a potent ground attack platform, but the risks were immense. Flying low meant exposure, and many Mustangs returned riddled with holes, or never returned at all. Korea was proving that the Mustang was still lethal, but its battles were now measured in survival against the ground, rather than dominance in the air. The geography of Korea magnified the Mustang's importance in the war's early days. With mountainous terrain, poor infrastructure, and limited airfields, jets often struggled to reach battle zones or loiter over targets. The Mustang's range and endurance made it invaluable. 51 said could fly long patrols, orbit above embattled ground units, and deliver firepower precisely where needed. For soldiers trapped in desperate situations, the sight of a Mustang diving from the clouds was salvation. Infantrymen often described the aircraft's roar as the sound of survival, knowing that its guns and rockets could scatter advancing enemies. From the defense of the Busan perimeter to the bold Incheon landings, Mustangs were ever present, providing critical air cover when it mattered most. These missions carried enormous weight, for they bridged the gap until jets could be brought fully into the theater. The Mustang was no longer the glamorous escort fighter. It was the workhorse, the guardian, and the lifeline of the battlefield. Its adaptability kept it relevant. Its resilience kept it flying. But while the Mustang excelled in close support, it could not turn back the tide of the jet age. By late 1950, the skies over Korea saw the arrival of the MiG-15, a swept-wing Soviet jet flown by North Korean, Chinese, and even covert Soviet pilots. The MiG-15 outclassed piston fighters entirely, flying faster, climbing higher, and maneuvering beyond anything the Mustang could match. When Mustangs encountered MiGs, they were forced to evade rather than engage, diving for the ground or seeking cover in clouds. The task of air superiority fell to the F-86 Sabre, America's answer to the MiG. The Mustang's new domain was firmly the ground war, not the air war. This shift underscored the irreversible transformation of aerial combat. No matter how legendary, no propeller-driven fighter could survive against jets in a contested sky. The Mustang had proven itself once again, but it was clear its days as a frontline air superiority fighter were over. The jet age had arrived, and it was unstoppable. Despite its vulnerability to jets, the Mustang became indispensable in Korea's ground campaigns. Its ruggedness allowed it to absorb punishment and still bring pilots home. Many airmen described Mustangs limping back to base with shredded wings, damaged engines, or missing control surfaces, yet somehow staying aloft. Maintenance crews worked miracles, patching bullet holes, replacing parts, and sending the fighters back into combat within hours. The Mustang's versatility as a ground attacker made it vital in the war's brutal ebb and flow. It destroyed tanks, cut supply lines, and hammered bridges, directly shaping the ground battle. For many UN troops, the Mustang became a trusted partner, a symbol of air power's ability to tip the balance in desperate fights. In this role, the Mustang showed its enduring value. It could no longer rule the skies, but it could still shape the battlefield. And in Korea, that was enough to keep it flying into legend. The pilots who flew Mustangs in Korea often reflected on the strange contrast between the wars. In Europe, they had fought high-altitude duels against Germany's best, escorting bombers through flak-filled skies. In Korea, they dove into valleys, strafed convoys, and fought an invisible enemy hidden among mountains and villages. The missions demanded different skills, different courage, but the essence of the Mustang remained. It was fast, agile, and responsive, giving its pilots confidence in combat. Many who flew both wars spoke of the Mustang as a companion, a machine that adapted to every challenge, no matter how the battlefield changed. But they also acknowledged the wear of ground attack missions, the constant risk of flak, the grinding fatigue of repeated sorties, the heartbreak of seeing comrades shot down over hostile territory. Korea gave the Mustang one final test, not of supremacy, but of endurance, and once again it passed, though at heavy cost. By 1951 and 1952, the Mustang's frontline role was diminishing. Jets were fully established, and Sabres carried the fight against MiGs, while newer ground attack aircraft entered the theater. Mustangs shifted into secondary roles, flying from smaller bases, patrolling quieter sectors, or serving with Allied air forces from South Korea and other United Nations partners. Many were eventually replaced, sold, or returned to storage, yet their impact in Korea had already been made. They had bought time in 1950, held the line when jets could not, and provided air support that saved countless lives. Their contribution was not glamorous, but it was decisive. In the story of the Korean War, the Mustang stands as the bridge between eras too old for dominance, yet too valuable to discard. It proved that even in obsolescence it could still matter. The Mustang's second war was its last as a frontline fighter, but it ended that chapter with honor. The Korean War marked the Mustang's final bow in the spotlight of major global conflict. It had entered history as a bomber escort, conquered Europe's skies, carried the war to Japan, and then returned 5 years later to fight again. In Korea, it proved that even in an age of jets, a well-designed piston fighter could still make a difference. It had strafed tanks, blasted bridges, and supported ground troops with the same determination it once used to chase Luftwaffe fighters. But it also revealed the limits of propeller-driven flight. The Mustang could no longer match the cutting edge of technology. Its time as the world's premier fighter had passed, yet its legacy was not diminished. Instead, it was deepened. The Mustang had fought 2 wars, in 2 different roles, across 2 very different eras. Few fighters could claim as much. Korea closed the chapter on its combat career, but it opened the door to its immortality. The Mustang was no longer just a weapon. It was history in motion. When the guns of World War II fell silent, the P-51 Mustang did not vanish into storage yards alone. Instead, thousands of airframes found new homes across the globe, as America and its wartime allies distributed surplus aircraft to friendly nations. In this way, the Mustang's story became international. The Royal Air Force, which had first embraced the Mustang in 1942, kept it in service well into the post-war years, flying both Merlin-powered P-51s and later variants. Canada's Royal Canadian Air Force operated the type as well, integrating it into their growing Cold War force structure. Australia's Royal Australian Air Force used Mustangs in occupation duties in Japan, and even deployed them during the early stages of the Korean War. For these nations, the Mustang represented not just a weapon but a continuation of wartime bonds, a common machine that tied Allied air forces together. Across the Commonwealth, its silhouette remained familiar. From Britain to Australia, the Mustang was still a trusted ally. Its global journey had only just begun. In Latin America, the Mustang became the crown jewel of many air forces. Nations such as Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, and Nicaragua all acquired Mustangs, integrating them into their fleets as primary fighters. These aircraft, though second-hand, were still far more advanced than anything their neighbors possessed. They patrolled coastlines, intercepted smugglers, and gave smaller nations a prestige symbol of modern air power. In some cases, they were even used in combat. During the 1954 Guatemalan coup, Mustangs flown by exiles and mercenaries clashed with government forces, marking one of the rare instances of Mustang versus Mustang combat. In the Dominican Republic, Mustangs remained in service well into the 1960s, flying alongside newer jets as proud relics of another age. For these countries, the Mustang was not just a fighter, it was a statement of sovereignty, a flag in the sky. Its roar over Havana or Santo Domingo carried both deterrence and pride. Few aircraft have been as influential in shaping the post-war identity of smaller nations. The Mustang was both sword and symbol. In the Middle East, the Mustang also found a new life. Egypt and Israel, 2 nations already at odds in the late 1940s, both fielded Mustangs in their fledgling air forces. In the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, Israeli Mustangs, smuggled and hastily assembled, flew combat missions against Arab aircraft, including Egyptian Spitfires and Mustangs of their own. This created a surreal scene. The same aircraft, once America's weapon of liberation, now flown by adversaries over the deserts of Palestine. These clashes were brutal and personal, with skilled pilots on both sides pushing the machine to its limits. For Israel, the Mustang became an early symbol of survival, giving its tiny air force the reach to strike deep into enemy territory. For Egypt, it represented modernization, a link to Western technology in a rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape. The Mustang thus became part of the Middle East's turbulent story, a machine caught between ideologies and nations. It was proof that aviation history did not end with World War II. It was being rewritten in the post-war skies. Across Asia, too, the Mustang carried its legend. The Royal Australian Air Force flew them during occupation duty in Japan, and later during the early Korean War, before transitioning to jets. The Philippines operated Mustangs during its own conflicts with insurgents, where they provided close air support and ground attack capability in a region plagued by unrest. Indonesia, emerging from Dutch colonial rule, also inherited Mustangs, which became symbols of independence and strength. Even South Korea, fighting for survival during the Korean War, flew Mustangs supplied by the United States. These aircraft became frontline tools of resistance and national defense. For young nations building their air forces from scratch, the Mustang was often the very first modern fighter in their inventory. It carried prestige, deterrence, and real combat utility. Its versatility ensured it could be adapted to roles from coastal patrol to counterinsurgency. The Mustang was not just a relic of Allied power, it was a bridge into the modern age of aviation for nations struggling to define themselves. Europe, too, remained a stronghold of Mustang service after the war. Sweden purchased surplus P-51s in the late 1940s, designating them J-26S and using them extensively as frontline fighters. For a neutral country, the Mustang represented a significant leap in capability, ensuring its air force remained competitive in an uncertain post-war world. Italy also received Mustangs, flying them in the early years of NATO as part of its reconstituted air arm. Other European nations, such as Denmark and the Netherlands, likewise operated Mustangs during the late 1940s and early 1950s. In each of these countries, the Mustang provided an affordable yet effective solution to post-war defense needs. Jets were still rare and costly, but the Mustang could fill the gap. It was rugged, versatile, and proven. For European nations rebuilding from the rubble, it was exactly what was needed. The Mustang thus became not only a war hero, but a peacekeeper, a familiar shape above cities still scarred by bomb craters. It was a reassuring reminder of Allied strength. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Mustang's post-war service was its sheer longevity. While jets became dominant in the 1950s, many air forces continued flying Mustangs into the 1960s and even the 1970s. In some Latin American countries, they remained operational well into the Cold War, outlasting not only their original designers' expectations, but even many first-generation jets. Their simplicity, ease of maintenance, and rugged design made them ideal for nations without vast industrial bases. They could be kept flying with ingenuity, spare parts, and determination. Pilots who flew them decades after World War II spoke of their reliability and responsiveness, qualities that still outshone many early jets. The Mustang's endurance made it more than just a fighter, it was a survivor. Few aircraft in history have bridged as many eras, from the piston-driven duels of 1943 to the missile age of the Cold War. Its persistence was as much about necessity as design, but it kept the Mustang's legend alive across continents and decades. The Mustang's export success also influenced geopolitics. By supplying Mustangs, the United States projected influence into Latin America, Asia, and the Middle East, strengthening alliances and shaping military balances. Owning Mustangs tied nations closer to the Western orbit, embedding them in logistical and training networks led by America. This was not merely about aviation, it was about strategy. Each Mustang sent abroad was also a political message, a demonstration of trust, support, and influence. In Latin America, Mustangs became symbols of pro-US governments. In Asia, they represented America's backing against communist insurgencies. In Europe, they tied rebuilding nations to NATO's collective defense. The Mustang thus became not only a weapon but a tool of diplomacy. Its wings carried not only bombs and bullets, but also ideology and alignment. Few fighters have ever been so deeply woven into the fabric of geopolitics. The Mustang was as much an ambassador as it was a warrior. By the 1960s, the Mustang's frontline service was finally ending, but its global story remained remarkable. It had flown in every corner of the world, in every climate, and under the flags of more than 20 nations. It had been a bomber escort over Germany, a ground attacker in Korea, a counterinsurgency fighter in the Philippines, and a prestige symbol in Latin America. It had clashed against itself in civil wars, fought alongside allies in coalition wars, and patrolled skies as a sentinel of peace. This adaptability ensured its survival long after most of its contemporaries had vanished. When the last operational Mustangs retired from national service, they did so not as obsolete relics, but as veterans of a career spanning 3 decades. For millions across the globe, the Mustang was not just America's fighter, it was their fighter too. Its roar had echoed over Berlin, Havana, Cairo, Manila, and Tel Aviv. Its shadow had crossed oceans and continents, and in every role, it had remained a symbol of courage, endurance, and freedom. The P-51 Mustang's legend was not forged solely in the skies over Europe or the Pacific. It was also constructed in the collective memory of those who lived through and after the war. As the years passed, the Mustang became more than a machine of rivets and engines. It became a symbol almost mythological in stature. Veterans recalled it as the fighter that never failed them, while civilians embraced it as the aircraft that won the air war. Myths grew around its invincibility, its supposed flawless record, and its superiority over every other fighter of the era. In truth, the Mustang was not perfect. It had weaknesses in low-level combat, suffered heavy losses, and was vulnerable to flak. But memory often amplifies victories and softens defeats. In the American imagination, the Mustang became the embodiment of victory in the skies. Its laminar flow wings, its sleek lines, and its distinctive Merlin growl all fed the legend. It was no longer just an aircraft, it was a cultural icon. One of the most persistent myths about the Mustang is that it was an unbeatable machine, unmatched by any other fighter. Veterans themselves sometimes fueled this belief, remembering their triumphs more vividly than their losses. In reality, Luftwaffe pilots flying Bf 109 sets, Pf 190s, and later Me 262 jets claimed many Mustangs during the war. Yet in the grand narrative of World War II, the Mustang's victories loomed larger than its defeats. Its ability to escort bombers deep into Germany, its kill ratio against German fighters, and its dominance in the late war created an aura of inevitability around it. Over time, this aura hardened into myth, the Mustang as the perfect fighter. Historians and aviation experts have since nuanced this picture, acknowledging that while the Mustang was not flawless, it was uniquely suited to its mission and its moment. Myths often grow not from lies, but from triumphs distilled into simple truths. And the simple truth was that the Mustang gave the Allies the skies. That truth became myth, and the myth became legend. Hollywood played a crucial role in cementing the Mustang's legend. War films of the 1940s and 1950s often depicted sleek P-51 soaring heroically, their red spinners gleaming as they saved bombers from German fighters. Even when Mustangs were not historically accurate to the setting, filmmakers used them because they symbolized World War II aviation in the public imagination. The silver Mustang with its shark mouth or red tail became cinematic shorthand for Allied air power. Later films, documentaries, and even television shows continued this tradition, using Mustangs as the centerpiece of aerial sequences. Hollywood did not dwell on its flaws or the grim attrition of ground attack missions. Instead, it celebrated the Mustang as the knight of the sky, the heroic steed of Allied pilots. Every appearance on the big screen reinforced its image as a legend. The real history of fatigue, losses, and imperfections was overshadowed by celluloid triumph. In film as in memory, the Mustang never lost. Literature too embraced the Mustang's mythos. Memoirs by fighter aces often highlighted the aircraft's responsiveness, speed, and reliability, framing it as a trusted partner in their most harrowing moments. Popular novels of the 1950s and 1960s, written against the backdrop of a nation that had emerged victorious from the war, presented the Mustang as a symbol of American ingenuity and courage. Aviation magazines devoted entire issues to its design, comparing it favorably to every opponent it had faced. For young readers, comic books and illustrated histories, filled with dramatic dogfight scenes, made the Mustang a vehicle of imagination as much as history. Its name appeared in pulp adventure stories, flight manuals, and even children's toys, embedding it into everyday culture. The Mustang was no longer just remembered, it was marketed, consumed, and reproduced in story after story. The written word elevated it from aircraft to archetype, and archetypes live longer than facts. Air shows and the warbird movement of the post-war decades amplified the Mustang's cultural presence. As surplus aircraft were sold to civilians, wealthy pilots and enthusiasts restored them, painting them in wartime colors and flying them for crowds. The sight of a gleaming Mustang performing loops and dives against a summer sky evoked nostalgia, pride, and awe. Crowds cheered not only the aerobatics but the history embodied in the aircraft. Air show announcers told stories of George Preddy, John C. Meyer, and the Tuskegee Airmen, turning the Mustang into a flying museum. Its deep Merlin roar became an audible link to the past, stirring emotions in veterans and civilians alike. For younger generations, seeing a Mustang fly kept the war's memory alive, decades after its end. In this way, the aircraft became more than a machine. It became a ritual of remembrance. Every flight at an airshow was a story retold, a legend relived, and a myth reinforced in the public imagination. The Mustang also entered popular culture in unexpected ways. It appeared on postage stamps, in advertising campaigns, and even in automotive branding. The Ford Mustang, introduced in 1964, borrowed its name and some of its aura from the fighter, linking speed, power, and American pride in both car and plane. Models, toys, and posters carried its image into bedrooms, offices, and classrooms. For decades, children built plastic kits of P-51s, dreaming of flying them through the clouds. The aircraft's distinctive shape became an icon, recognized even by those with no interest in aviation. It was no longer just a tool of war. It was a brand of freedom, aspiration, and excellence. Few fighters have achieved such universal recognition. The Mustang transcended aviation to become a symbol woven into the broader fabric of culture. From car dealerships to cereal boxes, its silhouette carried meaning. It had become an emblem of American spirit itself. But with legend comes simplification, and with simplification, exaggeration. Some stories of the Mustang grew into tall tales, claims that it never lost a bomber it escorted, that it outclassed every jet, that it was invulnerable to flak. These myths, though not factually accurate, reflected a deeper truth about how people wanted to remember the war. They wanted heroes, and the Mustang became one of them. Veterans themselves often encouraged these tales, not to deceive, but to honor the memory of friends and comrades who fought and died. The Mustang was easier to celebrate than the brutal realities of attrition, fear, and sacrifice. Myths wrapped the pain of war in the comfort of legend. Over time, these legends became part of history itself, taught in classrooms and repeated in documentaries. The line between fact and memory blurred, but for the Mustang, this blur only strengthened its hold on imagination. It was not only remembered, it was revered. By the 21st century, the Mustang had become immortal, not just as a restored warbird or a museum piece, but as a legend of culture. It was featured in Hollywood blockbusters, from war dramas to superhero films. Its roar captured with reverence by sound engineers. It appeared in video games, flight simulators, and virtual reality, allowing new generations to sit in its cockpit, if only digitally. Its story was told in books, documentaries, and classrooms, not just as a machine but as a myth of courage and freedom. The Mustang had entered the pantheon of symbols alongside the Spitfire, the Sherman tank, and the Higgins boat, machines remembered as instruments of victory. Myths and legends had transformed it into something greater than the sum of its parts. It was not just a fighter of World War II, it was a timeless icon. The Mustang lived on not in battles but in imagination, and in imagination it would never be defeated. The P-51 Mustang endures not simply as a machine of war, but as a living symbol of freedom, courage, and triumph. More than 80 years after its first flight, it remains revered as the greatest piston-engine fighter ever built, a title earned not just by its performance, but by the decisive role it played in shaping history. The Mustang combined speed, agility, range, and firepower in a harmony unmatched by its contemporaries. It was not flawless, but it was perfectly suited to the tasks demanded of it, escorting bombers deep into enemy territory, overwhelming the Luftwaffe, and carrying the war to Japan. Pilots who flew it spoke of its responsiveness as though it were alive, a partner in battle rather than a machine. Historians note that no other fighter so completely altered the strategic balance in the air. Veterans recall its sound, the deep-throated roar of the Merlin, as the anthem of liberation. The Mustang was more than an aircraft. It was a promise in metal and fuel, a promise that freedom would prevail. Preservation has kept that promise alive. Across the world, Mustangs sit proudly in museums, their wings polished and their histories carefully preserved. Visitors to places like the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., or the Imperial War Museum in Duxford, England, stand in awe before the sleek lines that once ruled the skies. Each aircraft tells a story of the men who flew it, the missions it completed, and the wars it helped to end. Restorers labor tirelessly to keep these machines in pristine condition, often rebuilding them from wreckage recovered in barns, jungles, or airfields long abandoned. To walk around a Mustang today is to step back into history, to feel the weight of its presence not just as metal, but as memory. For younger generations, these museum pieces are lessons in courage, innovation, and sacrifice. They are not relics, they are reminders, and in their preservation the Mustang continues its mission, educating, inspiring, and enduring. But the Mustang is not confined to static displays. It lives in the skies, where its legacy breathes most vividly. At air shows around the globe, Mustangs roar once more, their Merlin engines echoing across fields filled with spectators. Pilots push them into loops, rolls, and high-speed passes, demonstrating the grace and power that once humbled the Luftwaffe. Crowds cheer, veterans wipe away tears, and children watch with wide eyes as history comes alive overhead. These performances are more than entertainment. They are ceremonies of remembrance, keeping the connection between past and present unbroken. Every growl of the engine is a salute to the men who flew them in war. Every wingtip pass is a reminder of battles fought and sacrifices made. In these moments, the Mustang ceases to be an artifact. It becomes once again what it was always meant to be: freedom's fighter, soaring in defiance of time itself. The Mustang's legacy also endures in the hearts of those who fly it today. A rare group of pilots, collectors, and enthusiasts have dedicated their lives to keeping these machines airworthy. They speak of the Mustang with reverence, describing its controls as extensions of their own bodies, its engine as a living heart. The responsibility of flying such an icon is immense. They are not just pilots, they are custodians of history. Many spend fortunes restoring and maintaining their aircraft, ensuring that future generations can hear the Merlin's roar. These flights are not about vanity, but stewardship. They keep alive a direct link to World War II, bridging the gap between memory and experience. For those lucky enough to sit in a Mustang's cockpit, every flight is more than aviation, it is communion with history. The Mustang has no equal in this regard. It is not only flown, it is honored. Its influence extends even into modern technology and culture. Designers, engineers, and military strategists still study the Mustang's combination of efficiency and power. Its laminar flow wing design, radical for its time, remains a touchstone in the history of aerodynamics. The very idea that a single fighter could escort bombers across Europe reshaped air power strategy forever, laying the groundwork for doctrines that persist into the jet age. Beyond the military, the Mustang inspired popular culture in countless forms: films, novels, toys, and even automobiles. The Ford Mustang, launched in 1964, was named to capture the fighter's spirit of speed, agility, and freedom, cementing the name in a new domain. The aircraft's silhouette adorns posters, t-shirts, and artworks across the world. For engineers, it was inspiration. For artists, it was muse. For the public, it was icon. Few machines transcend their original purpose so completely. The Mustang did. Yet what makes the Mustang's legacy unique is not just its design or performance, it is its symbolism. It represents a time when the world's fate hung in the balance, and when innovation and courage combined to shift that balance toward freedom. It represents the sacrifice of pilots who gave their lives in it, the triumphs of aces who made it famous, and the collective will of nations who relied upon it. Its red tails evoke the courage of the Tuskegee Airmen. Its polished aluminum gleam recalls bomber streams over Germany. Its shark mouths, checkered noses, and squadron insignias tell stories of individuality within the vast machinery of war. The Mustang embodies not just the United States but the Allied cause as a whole, standing for unity, resilience, and victory. Every rivet carries history. Every flight echoes memory. The Mustang's legacy is human as much as mechanical. It is a symbol of people, of their struggle, and of their triumph. The passage of time has only deepened the Mustang's legend. As World War II veterans pass into memory, the aircraft they flew become more precious than ever. The Mustang, preserved in metal and memory, serves as a bridge between generations. For children who never knew the war, its sight and sound bring history alive. For veterans who once touched its controls, it is a reunion with an old friend. Its continued flight at air shows is not just spectacle but education, reminding the world that freedom was not free, and that machines like the Mustang helped secure it. Museums, documentaries, and schools teach its story, but nothing compares to the visceral power of seeing it fly. The Mustang's wings still lift not only themselves, but also the weight of remembrance. It is as relevant now as it was in 1944, because its meaning has outlived its era. Its legacy is not fading. It is soaring. And so the P-51 Mustang stands in history as more than a fighter. It is freedom's fighter. It is remembered as the aircraft that carried bombers to Berlin, defended soldiers in Korea, served nations across the globe, and inspired generations in peace. Its roar is the sound of victory. Its wings are the canvas of memory. Its silhouette is etched into the imagination of the world. Long after other machines of its age have rusted into obscurity, the Mustang continues to fly, not just in air shows but in the hearts of millions. It embodies the courage of its pilots, the ingenuity of its designers, and the triumph of the cause it served. In museums, in films, in the skies, and in memory, the Mustang endures. The war it fought has ended, but its mission remains to inspire, to remind, and to honor. The P-51 Mustang is not only a legend of war, it is a legend of freedom itself.